Panzishinga, Panzine, Sura, Yonji Lighter, and the planet. Piatanaria, Bushode. Blue Bushod Lanoso. The Goshinga, Panzino, Lupi Lare. Come on, look at you, Panzine, Soroshi. The Goshinga, a Genadia, see the la, Pinya, see the lachia. A Genadia, she measuring. The Rawari comes out over Panzambia. No, the Rawari comes up with Panzambia. The Rawari go Tankade, so Maluao, Genadiashi. Maybe Panzan had it. The Rawari, Bioshin Chami, the needed Panzambibo. So I do Panzana Mahod on my way. Go aim up Chilade, go down the media, Poma. Mibari had two neither made a tanager. Beda, the media, she say. Alo, do you dare abuse to be good and good me, Chiwasi Genet Sanashi? Era the way of the Goshin of Panelide, Dada Midi to Pure. Hey, Dada Midi, Emma. Lema read Dada Midi Shima, might at Dada Midi Shima. Pay Dada Midi, Chinna Mutaku in it. Gonza on. Tu Panzemaro, the Magone say board that we will count a say ball on Panzan light up. No, but not at that we will allow on Panzan light. Pinya Madade that we will Pinya down on Panzan light bubble. Panzan 9 years so matter, come Panzan. Erelo Mohobene Panzan I had done it. Lugin to Bali had done it. The Chojaro, Yoso, Chitani Panzan light day. Africa died that is a major on Panzantar, no? Uroba Lurido, Carapunisa GDP on Panzanite. But Mari Jaro, Chojolo, Mount Lala Baba on Panzanite. Aido, tu Panzana, but Maria Ginagon Gina Leve, Africa, Gina Chimachina, no? Do it cheat, Abba. Do it cheat. Gina Mammo. Anyway, Chanda do they got. Chinama said, say it to the Jinanamu. Tururo, Chana of Hazene, Arojaro, Chana of Hazemu, so be. Pitimave. Ereluri, Pilan, 9 A Pilan and the Dreja. Panzation, Sura, Luranga, Lekan, Mam, Honam. Luranga, Ginu Jama, Hofu. Dodo purely me. Luri Magano, the Lupia, Ludo. A pig I told you. Edo, Magani and go on my Panzan people, Panzan night now, eh? The Goshi de solution, Magana Lu, go on Lupilla. Say to that Lu, say she on Panzan Billa. Doda G. Lu, Doda Maji on Panzan Billa. I look at low names one share than it, but look a bit, eh? Major shit like that, no? Adam yes of Yaga. Pago weaver top yap be the little solution. Pansin sing up, Pansin de look, Pansin look, Pierre de look so that. A dwee call a dee mingu. Let can't have a book de out for it. Go go in load in a case, load in a case, switch a way, take them shit over. Pablo Rosoin. Pierre again, Lord Roger, by Pierre Mave. Go a go, you chat was a malo. However, we do, no Roger time, do Pazena. Garania, sorry, load in a case and a load in a case. Sura, Luria, go a go, you chat, nature, David Mishu. You chat them, Luro. Lucana, so though we know. Sana alias or Juba Atomu, so though we know. A chain down losing, Panzation, and the 2 seamen Kaya Mavip. Erajamulu, Louis Lola Wiria, Dipia, Sandaru, Domo and Nora, Pset 190. Send a live solution. Luria, for what yada de Kama. A young one at the Muire Bugushide, no. The Rawari, then the Muire Bugushide. Magone do say I didn't, the Muire Bugurishide, Swing we young chappy, the Muire Bugurishide. Ere solution, she say, point beetle, she young yada, le piata can fancy no la. The code me up, she beetle. To me up is you, Lu, Daiko, Josa, and le piata can fancy no la. Ero fancy being a town edge, or le piata can fancy no town chare, the other year chara, Mahopu, era solution. The other year town chara, Mobu, a bigger town chara, Mahopu. Here the king at town chare, so Piosia, a bit Nasari, Miapilla. Since Asiari, Miapilla. Era Miasovia, since Apia. Here the king Fanzeno do that Daniare, here the king Fanzeno do Miausa, Coniare. Here the king Fanzeno, Jacuri, what young needed. Here the king Fanzeno, Lulain do Compiniare. Here the king Fanzeno. Muye se wari toni yare so Davidမျိုးတွေဖြစ်ကုန်ရောအဲ့ဒါလို့မစီလျော်တဲ့အခြေအနေမျိုးတွေဖြစ်ပေါ်လာစေတယ်ဒါကြောင့်မြတ်စွာဘုရားကအဲ့ဒါဟာမှန်ကန်မှုမရှိဘူးတကယ်ကတော့လူဘဝရလာတယ်ဆိုတာဟာဘယ်သူမပြုမိမိမှုမိမိကိုယ်တိုင်လုပ်ခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းလူတွေဟာကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရကြတာလားဖြစ်တယ်ကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရတယ်ဆိုဟုတ်တယ်ကိုအသက်မွေးဝမ်းကြောင်းမုံဖုတ်ပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်ရွှေရောင်ချပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်စတိုးဆိုင်ဖွင့်ပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်တကူကိုလှုပ်နဲ့ကိုလှုပ်နေကြတာပဲလေကိုဝါသနာပါရလှုပ်ကြတာပြီးတော့အလုတ်မကောင်းမှုဆိုလည်းပြောင်းလို့ရလေဖန်ဆင်းထိုင်ပြောင်းလို့မရတော့ဘူးဖန်ဆင်းကြတယ်ဒီတိုင်းဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်တာဆိုပြောင်းမရအခုကပြောင်းရကိုဒီလုတ်မကြိုက်ဘူးဆိုနောက်တစ်လုတ်ပြောင်းရတချို့ဆိုဆရာဝန်တင်နန်းတက်ပြီးတော့ဘွဲတွေပါတွေရပြီးတော့ဆရာဝန်လုံးမစားခြင်းတို့တခါဈေးရောင်းစားတာတွေလည်းပြည့်အဲ့တော့ဘုရားသခင်ကလွယ်လွယ်မမဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်သလားမသိဘူးအဲ့ဒါကြတော့နော်မင်းဆရာဝန်ဆေးကြောင်းတော့တက်ဒါပေမဲ့မင်းဆရာဝန်မလုံးနဲ့လို့များဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်သလားအဲ့ဒီလိုတွေစဉ်းစားစရာတွေဖြစ်ကုန်တယ်နော်တကယ်ကတော့လူတွေဟာကိုယ်ဆုံးဖြတ်ချက်နဲ့ကိုယ်လုံးနေကြတာဆိုတာထင်ရှားတယ်ကိုယ်ဆုံးဖြတ်ချက်နဲ့အဲ့တော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကကမ္မတက္ကတတမ္မာဒိဋ္ဌိလူဘဝရလာတယ်ဆိုတာတဲ့ကိုလုံးထားအောင်မို့ဆိုလေးရှိတယ် we are our own architect ကိုဘဝကိုပဲဖန်ဆင်းလာအဲ့ဒီအယူဆအမြင်ကိုဘုန်းကြီးတို့တော့အလွန်ကျေနပ်တယ်ဘာဖြစ်လို့တော့ဆိုကောင်းလဲကိုမှတောင်းရှိတယ်မကောင်းလဲကိုပဲတောင်းရှိတယ်အလွန်ကိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်အလွန်ကိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်ကိုဘာဖြစ်ချင်တယ်လဲဖြစ်အောင်လုပ်ကိုဘာကြိုက်တယ်လဲကြိုက်တာလုပ်လို့ရလူတွေကမသိခင်လည်းပဲဒီလိုပဲရွေးကြတာပဲလေရွေးကြတာကိုကြိုက်တဲ့ပညာသင်တယ်ကိုလှုပ်ချင်တဲ့လုပ်ငန်းလုပ်ကြတယ်လှုပ်ကြတာကိုယ့်ကိုရွေးချယ်မှုနဲ့သွားကြတာပဲဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့အဲ့တော့ဘဝမှာလည်းပဲကိုယ့်ကိုရွေးချယ်လို့ရတယ်မြတ်စွာဘုရားကအကြောင်းနဲ့အကျိုးဟောထားတာဖြစ်လို့ဒါနကောင်းမှုလုပ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေဟာဟိုဘဝကျတော့ချမ်းသာကြွယ်ဝမယ်သီလကောင်းမှုလုပ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေဟာကျမ်းမာမယ်သက်ရှိမယ်နော်ဒါနသီလပြည့်စုံတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေကလူဘဝလူချမ်းသာကိုရတယ်လွန်လွန်ကဲကဲဒါနသီလကိုလုပ်ပြီးဆိုရင်နတ်ဘဝကိုရောက်တယ်နတ်ပြည်ရောက်ပြီးတော့ချမ်းသာမယ်သမထကျင့်စဉ်တစ်ခုကိုအောင်မြင်မြင်ကျင့်မယ်ဆိုရင်ဗြဟ္မဘုံရောက်တယ်ကဘာကြာအောင်ကဘာပေါင်းများစွာကြာအောင်အသက်ရှိတယ်ဝိပဿနာကျင့်စဉ်ကိုကျင့်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်တဏှာဝကလွတ်မြောက်တယ်ဆိုတာသူကျင့်စဉ်နဲ့သူအကြောင်းနဲ့သူဟာသူဒီလိုဟောတာဘယ်သူမှဖန်ဆင်းတာမဟုတ်အဲ့ဒီလိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုလုံးလို့ရဖျားဖြစ်ပြီးတော့တရားတွေကိုကဲ့တင်ရင်လည်းပဲဖျားစုပန်ပြီးပါရမီဖြစ်တယ်နော်အေးဖျားမဖြစ်ဖျားဖြစ်ရမှာပါရမီဖြစ်ရမှာကြောက်တယ်အဲ့ကတာဝကလောက်ဆိုတော်ပါပြီဆိုရင်လေပါရမီဖြစ်ဖျားမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးဖျားအဖေအမေဖြစ်ချင်တယ်ဆိုတော့ပါရမီဖြစ်လို့ရအဲ့ဒါလို့ပေါ့အမျိုးစုံကိုကြိုက်တာကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ခွင့်ရှိကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ခွင့်ရှိတာဘယ်လောက်ရှိနေလဲဆို နော်အခုခေတ်မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကိုယ့်အကိုရွေးချက်ခွင့်မရှိတာတွေဟာရှိသေးတယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချက်ခွင့်မရှိဘူးဆေးချောင်းတက်ချင်တဲ့အမှတ်က300လောက်400လောက်ဖြစ်တယ်ရွေးလို့မရဗျာနော်အင်ဂျင်နီယာဝင်နေအမှတ်နဲ့နေရွေးလို့မရဗျာကိုကြိုက်တာတောင်မှပဲလူဘဝဟာရွေးလို့မရတာအများကြီးရှိတယ်အဲ့တော့ဒီကံတရားနဲ့ပတ်သက်လာလို့ရှိရင်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးလို့ရလုံးဝဆောင်ဝဲအမှတ်နဲ့ချိတ်ဆက်ထားတာမရှိဘူးနော်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးပြီးတော့အလုပ်ပဲလုပ်ဖို့လိုတယ်ပညာတတ်ကြီးဖြစ်ခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ပညာပါရမီဖြစ်ပညာပါရမီဖြစ်ရသင်ကြားရမယ်ပညာတကယ်ကိုတကူရှင်ကြီးဖြစ်ခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုတကူရခြင်းအကြောင်းတရားတွေကိုလို့သူတို့ဆိုလိုတာပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့ကိုကိုချောမောလှပခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ပြုံးပြုံးလေးနေစိတ်မဆိုးနဲ့စိတ်ဆိုးရင်လူဟာစိတ်ဆိုးရင်အယုတ်ဆိုးကြည့်တတ်တယ်လေဒေါသထွက်လာလို့ရှိရင်လူဟာနှုတ်ခမ်းညက်ဆူတာချောတဲ့လူတောင်မှပဲစိတ်ဆိုးရင်အလှပြက်သွားတာပဲဒါသဘာဝနော်ခဏခဏစိတ်တူလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒီပုံစံကြီးဖြစ်လာတာဒါကြောင့်မို့ထံပြင်းဒေါသကြည်လွန်ကအလှပြက်ပြီဆိုစိတ်တူတဲ့လူဟာဖြစ်လျက်ဘဝမှာမျက်နှာကြီးကထဏ္ဏကြီးနဲ့ဟုတ်လားမျက်နှာပုတ်ကြီးနဲ့ဖြစ်တတ်တယ်တဲ့အဲ့ဒါအစရေကဒေါသမရှိဘူးအလုံးကပြုံးပြုံးရွှင်ရွှင်ခင်ခင်မင်မင်နေတတ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တယောက်ဟာအဲ့ဒီကြည်လင်တဲ့မျက်နှာနဲ့ပဲဘဝမှာဖြစ်တယ်ဟောသူလုပ်ခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းသူဖြစ်တာလေအသားဖြူခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တချို့ကအသားဖြူခြင်းတို့လည်းဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတယ်အဲ့ဒါတော့သိမစီဆိုင်ဘူးတမန်တော့အသားဖြူခြင်းတို့ဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတာတဲ့တချို့တက္ကမကြီးတွေကြမ်းကြမ်းဖန်ဖန်အဲ့လိုလုပ်တယ်ဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတာတောင်ရိုးရိုးမလှူအသားဖြူခြင်းတို့ထုံးလှူပါလားဆိုထုံးတော့မလှူအဲ့ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မိသွေးလှူလို့ရှိရင်အသားမဲမယ်ဆိုပုံစံဖြစ်အဲ့ဒါလို့လည်းမဟုတ်နိုင်ဘူးနော်အတုံးကတခြားစီဘူးတုံးကတခြားဆိုလို့ရင်းကအသားဖြူတာဟာချောမောလှပခြင်းနဲ့မှပါတယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မေတ္တာရှိတဲ့မျက်နှာရှင်ဟာချောမောလှပမှာဒေါသကြီးတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဟာဖြစ်လျက်ဘဝမှာဒီရုပ်ဆိုးချစ်တန်ဒီဘဝမှာဒါနကောင်းမှုလုပ်လို့ရှိရင်နောက်မှချမ်းသာကြွယ်ဝလို့ဖြစ်တယ်မလူရဲ့မတန်းရဲ့နှမျောဖက်နေတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီနောက်ဘဝကျစားရမယ်မဲ့တောင်းရမယ်ဖြစ်တယ်ဒီဘဝပညာမသိတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ကနောက်ဘဝလည်းပညာတတ်ဖို့ခက်ခဲတယ်ပညာသိတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ကနောက်ဘဝပညာတတ်နိုင်တယ်သူများအသက်မတတ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီနောက်ဘဝအသက်ရှိသူများအသက်တွေတတ်ပြီးတော့အသက်ရှိပါစေဆုတောင်းလို့လည်းမရဘူးအသက်တူတတ်တယ်သူများကိုနှိပ်စက်ညှဉ်းပန်းတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီတစ်ဖက်သားခံရတယ်လို့သူလည်းယောဂဝေဒနာတွေဖြစ်ပြီးတော့ဖြစ်တယ်မူရစေဝါရှောင်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဟာနောက်ဘဝမှာအယူအနံ့မဖြစ်ဘူးမူရစေဝါသုံးဆွဲလို့ရှိရင်မူးတယ်ဆိုတာမူးတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အယူဖြစ်တာပဲလေအဲ့ဒီမူရစေဝါသုံးပြီဆိုရင်နောက်ဘဝမှာအယူအနံ့သွားဖြစ်တယ်တော့အဲ့ဒါလို့သူ့အကြောင်းနဲ့သူ့အကျိုးကြည့်လိုက်တဲ့အခါကျတော့ကိုကောင်းစားခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုရင်ကိုကောင်းတဲ့အလုပ်ပဲလုပ်ဖို့လိုတယ်အဲ့ဒါအလုံးကိုလွတ်လပ်လို့အလွန်ကျင့်တတ်တယ်ဘုန်းကြီးတို့လွန်ကျင့်တတ်တယ်အဲ့လိုမဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့တဏ္ဍာရဘုရားသခင်ကဘယ်တော့မှမလဲဆိုတဲ့ညနာလေးမော့ပြီးမျောနေရမယ်ဘဝဟာအလွန်ဆိုးတဲ့ဘဝပဲနော်သူစိတ်ပါမှာဖန်ဆဲမှာစိတ်မပိုင်ပြစ်ထားလဲကိုခံရမှာဘာလုပ်လို့မရဘူးဟုတ်အဲ့လိုမဟုတ်ဘူးမြတ်စွာဘုရားကြတော့အဲ့တော့ကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရတယ်ဆိုကိုယ့်ကိုကြိုးစားလို့ရှိရင်ကိုကြိုးစားတဲ့အတိုင်းဖြစ်လာဝိရိယရဲ့အကျိုးဟာရှိလာဒါမှမဟုတ်ဗမာစကားမှာလဲကြိုးစားကဘုရားတောင်ဖြစ်တယ်ဆိုတာရှိတယ်ပေါ့အဲ့ဒါဟာကျင့်တတ်ဖွယ်အကောင်းဆုံးအဲ့ဒါကမ္မတက္ကတာသမ္မာဒိဋ္ဌိဆိုတဲ့ကံကံဤအကျိုးပေါ်မှာမိခိုးရှုမြင်တတ်တဲ့အတိဉာဏ်ဟာဘယ်လောက်ထိအောင် လူတွေရဲ့ဘဝကိုထက်တန်းကိုရောက်သွားစေနိုင်တယ်ဆိုတာစဉ်းစားကြည့်ပေါ့ဒါမို့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကံကံဤကျိုးကိုယုံကြည်လက်ခံခြင်းသိမြင်ခြင်းဆိုတဲ့ကာမတက္ကတာသမ္မာဒိဋ္ဌိဟာမှန်ကန်တဲ့အမြင်တစ်ခုဖြစ်တယ်အဲ့ဒီမှန်ကန်တဲ့အမြင်ကိုခြေခံပြီးဒါနကောင်းမှုသီလကောင်းမှုလုပ်ခြင်းအပြင်လူတွေဟာချမ်းသာဒုက္ခရကြတယ်ဆိုတာကိုအတိအကျဟောထားတာဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့
Chapter 7 He continued growing up with Jehovah. Paragraphs 1 and 2 question, in what setting did Samuel address the people of Israel, and why did he need to move them to repentance? Samuel looked into the faces of his people. The nation had gathered at the town of Gilgal, summoned by this faithful man who had served as prophet and judge for decades. It was May or June by modern reckoning. The dry season was well along. The fields in the region were golden with wheat, ready for harvest. Silence fell over the crowd. How could Samuel reach their hearts? The people did not understand how serious their situation was. They had insisted on having a human king to rule over them. They did not grasp that they had shown gross disrespect to their God Jehovah and to his prophet. They were, in effect, rejecting Jehovah as their king. How could Samuel move them to repentance? Paragraphs 3 and 4, question A. Why did Samuel speak of his youth? Question B. Why is Samuel's example of faith useful for us today? Samuel spoke. I have grown old and gray, he told the crowd. His whitening hair added weight to his words. He then said, I have walked before you from my youth until this day. 1 Samuel 12:2. Though Samuel was old, he had not forgotten his youth. His memories of those early days were still vivid. The decisions he had made back then as a growing boy had led him to a life of faith and devotion to his God Jehovah. Samuel had to build and maintain faith, although again and again he was surrounded by people who were faithless and disloyal. Today it is just as challenging to build faith, for we live in a faithless and corrupt world.
Luke 18:8 reads, I tell you, he will cause justice to be done to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man arrives, will he really find the faith on the earth?
Let us see what we can learn from Samuel's example, starting in his early boyhood. Ministering before Jehovah as a boy. Paragraphs 5 and 6 question, how was Samuel's childhood unusual, but why were his parents sure that he was cared for? Samuel had an unusual childhood. Shortly after he was weaned, at perhaps 3 years of age or a little more, he began a life of service at the sacred tabernacle of Jehovah at Shiloh, over 20 miles from his home in Ramah. His parents, Elkanah and Hannah, dedicated their boy to Jehovah in a special form of service, making him a lifelong Nazirite. The footnote reads, Nazirites were under a vow that included a ban on drinking alcoholic beverages and on cutting their hair. Most undertook such vows for only a set period of time, but a few, such as Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, were lifelong Nazirites. End of footnote. Did this mean that Samuel was cast off, unloved by his parents? Far from it. They knew that their son would be cared for at Shiloh. High priest Eli no doubt supervised matters, for Samuel worked closely with him. There were also a number of women who served in some connection with the tabernacle, evidently in an organized way. Paragraphs 7 and 8, question A. Year by year, how did Samuel's parents give him loving encouragement? Question B, what can parents today learn from Samuel's parents? Furthermore, Hannah and Elkanah never forgot their beloved firstborn, whose very birth was an answer to a prayer. Hannah had asked God for a son, promising to dedicate the boy to God in a life of sacred service. When visiting each year, Hannah brought Samuel a new sleeveless coat she had made for his tabernacle service. The little boy surely cherished those visits. He no doubt thrived on his parents' loving encouragement and guidance as they taught him what a privilege it was to serve Jehovah in that unique place. Parents today can learn a lot from Hannah and Elkanah. It is common for parents to focus all their child-rearing efforts on material concerns while ignoring spiritual needs. But Samuel's parents put spiritual matters first, and that had a great bearing on the kind of man their son grew up to be.
Proverbs 22:6 reads, "Train up a boy according to the way for him. Even when he grows old, he will not turn aside from it."
Paragraphs 9 and 10, Part A, describe the tabernacle and young Samuel's feelings about that sacred place. Question B, what might Samuel's responsibilities have included, and how do you think young ones today might imitate his example? We can picture the boy growing bigger and exploring the hills around Shiloh. As he gazed down on the town and the valley that spread out below it on one side, his heart likely swelled with joy and pride when he caught sight of Jehovah's tabernacle. That tabernacle was a sacred place indeed. The footnote reads, "The sanctuary was a rectangular structure, basically a great tent on a wooden framework. However, it was made of the finest of materials, sealskins, beautifully embroidered cloths, and costly woods plated with silver and gold. The sanctuary sat within a rectangular courtyard that included an impressive altar for sacrifices. Over time, other chambers evidently were erected at the sides of the tabernacle for the use of the priests. Samuel, it seems, slept in such a chamber." End of footnote. Built nearly 400 years earlier under the direction of Moses himself, it was the one center for the pure worship of Jehovah in all the world. Young Samuel grew to love the tabernacle. In the account he later wrote, we read, "Samuel was ministering before Jehovah as a boy, having a linen ephod girded on." 1 Samuel 2:18. That simple, sleeveless garment evidently indicated that Samuel assisted the priests at the tabernacle. Although not of the priestly class, Samuel had duties that included opening the doors to the tabernacle courtyard in the morning and attending to elderly Eli. As much as he enjoyed the privileges, though, in time his innocent heart became troubled. Something was terribly wrong at Jehovah's house. Staying pure in the face of corruption. Paragraphs 11 and 12, Question A. Hophni and Phinehas manifested what principal failing? Question B. What kind of wickedness and corruption did Hophni and Phinehas practice at the tabernacle? At a young age, Samuel witnessed genuine wickedness and corruption. Eli had two sons named Hophni and Phinehas. Samuel's account reads, "The sons of Eli were good-for-nothing men. They did not acknowledge Jehovah." 1 Samuel 2:12. The two thoughts in this verse go hand in hand. Hophni and Phinehas were good-for-nothing men, literally sons of worthlessness, because they had no regard for Jehovah. They thought nothing of his righteous standards and requirements. From that one failing sprang all their other sins. God's law was specific about the priests' duties and the way that they were to offer sacrifices at his tabernacle. For good reason. Those sacrifices represented God's provisions to forgive sins so that people could be clean in his eyes, eligible for his blessing and guidance. But Hophni and Phinehas led their fellow priests to treat the offerings with great disrespect. The footnote reads, "The account provides two examples of disrespect. For one thing, the law specified which pieces of a sacrificial offering were to go to the priests to eat. But at the tabernacle, the wicked priests had set up a very different practice. They would have their attendants simply jab a great fork into the cauldron where the meat was boiling, taking whatever choice morsel came out. For another thing, when people brought their sacrifices to be burned at the altar, the wicked priests would have an attendant bully the offerer, demanding the raw meat even before the fat of the sacrifice was offered to Jehovah." End of footnote. Paragraphs 13 and 14, question A. How were sincere people no doubt affected by the wickedness at the tabernacle? Question B. How did Eli fail, both as a father and as high priest? Imagine young Samuel watching, wide-eyed, as such gross abuses went on uncorrected. How many people did he see, including poor, humble, downtrodden folk, approaching that sacred tabernacle in hopes of finding some spiritual comfort and strength, only to leave disappointed, hurt, or humiliated? And how did he feel when he learned that Hophni and Phinehas also disregarded Jehovah's laws on sexual morality, as they had relations with some of the women who were serving there at the tabernacle? Perhaps he looked hopefully to Eli to do something about it. Eli was in the best position to address the growing disaster. As high priest, he was responsible for what took place at the tabernacle. As a father, he had an obligation to correct his sons. After all, they were hurting themselves as well as countless others in the land. However, Eli failed on both counts, as a father and as high priest. He offered his sons only a bland, weak scolding.
1 Samuel 2:23-25 reads, "And he used to say to them, 'Why do you keep doing things like these? For the things I am hearing about you from all the people are bad. No, my sons, because the report is not good that I am hearing, that the people of Jehovah are causing to circulate. If a man should sin against a man, God will arbitrate for him. But if it is against Jehovah that a man should sin, who is there to pray for him?' But they would not listen to the voice of their father, because Jehovah was now pleased to put them to death."
But his sons needed far stronger discipline. They were committing sins worthy of death. Paragraph 15, question. Jehovah sent what strong message to Eli, and how did Eli's family respond to the warning? Matters reached such a point that Jehovah sent a man of God, an unnamed prophet, to Eli with a strong message of judgment. Jehovah told Eli, "You keep honoring your sons more than me." 1 Samuel 2:27 through 3:1. God thus foretold that Eli's wicked sons would die on the same day, and that Eli's family would suffer greatly, even losing its privileged position in the priestly class. Did this powerful warning bring about a change in that family? The record reveals no such change of heart. Paragraph 16, question A. What reports do we read regarding young Samuel's progress? Question B. Do you find those reports heartwarming? Explain. How did all this corruption affect young Samuel? From time to time in this dark account, we find bright rays of light, good news about Samuel's growth and progress. Recall that at 1 Samuel 2:18, we read that Samuel was faithfully ministering before Jehovah as a boy. Even at that early age, Samuel centered his life on his service to God. In verse 21 of the same chapter, we read something even more heartwarming. The boy Samuel continued growing up with Jehovah. As he grew, his bond with his heavenly Father got stronger. Such a close, personal relationship with Jehovah is the surest protection against any form of corruption. Paragraphs 17 and 18, Question A. How might Christian youths imitate Samuel's example when faced with corruption? Question B. What shows that Samuel chose the right course? It would have been easy for Samuel to reason that if the high priest and his sons can give in to sin, he might as well do whatever he wished. But the corruption of others, including those in positions of authority, is never an excuse to sin. Today, many Christian youths follow Samuel's example and keep growing up with Jehovah, even when some around them fail to set a good example. How did such a course work out for Samuel? We read, all the while the boy Samuel was growing bigger and more likable, both from Jehovah's standpoint and from that of men. 1 Samuel 2:26. So Samuel was well liked, at least by those whose opinions mattered. Jehovah himself cherished this boy for his faithful course. And Samuel surely knew that his God would act against all the badness going on in Shiloh. But perhaps he wondered when. One night, such questions met an answer. Speak, for your servant is listening. Paragraphs 19 and 20, Part A, describe what happened to Samuel late one night at the tabernacle. Question B, how did Samuel learn the source of the message, and how did he treat Eli? It was nearing morning, but still dark. The flickering light of the tent's great lamp was still burning. In the stillness, Samuel heard a voice calling his name. He thought it was Eli, who was now very old and nearly blind. Samuel got up and went running to the old man. Can you see the boy in your mind's eye, hurrying barefoot to see what Eli needed? It is touching to note that Samuel treated Eli with respect and kindness. In spite of all his sins, Eli was still Jehovah's high priest. Samuel woke Eli, saying, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said that he had not called and sent the boy back to bed. Well, the same thing happened again and then again. Finally, Eli realized what was going on. It had become rare for Jehovah to send a vision or a prophetic message to his people, and it is not hard to see why. But Eli knew that Jehovah was speaking again, now to this boy. Eli told Samuel to go back to bed and instructed him on how to answer properly. Samuel obeyed. Soon he heard the voice calling, "Samuel, Samuel." The boy answered, "Speak, for your servant is listening." 1 Samuel 3:1 and 5 through 10. Paragraph 21, question. How can we listen to Jehovah today, and why is it worthwhile to do so? Jehovah did at last have a servant in Shiloh who was listening. That became Samuel's life pattern. Is it yours? We do not have to wait for a supernatural voice in the night to speak to us. Today, God's voice is always there for us, in a sense. It is there in His completed Word, the Bible. The more we listen to God and respond, the more our faith will grow. So it was with Samuel. Paragraphs 22 and 23. Question A. How did the message that Samuel at first feared to deliver come true? Question B. How did Samuel's reputation continue to grow? That night in Shiloh was a milestone in Samuel's life, for then he began to know Jehovah in a special sense, becoming God's own prophet and spokesman. At first, the boy was afraid to deliver Jehovah's message to Eli, for it was a final pronouncement that the prophecy against that family was soon to come true. But Samuel mustered the courage, and Eli humbly acquiesced to the divine judgment. Before long, everything Jehovah had said was fulfilled. Israel went to war with the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas were both killed on the same day, and Eli himself died on learning that Jehovah's sacred ark had been captured. However, Samuel's reputation as a faithful prophet only grew. Jehovah himself proved to be with him, the account says, adding that Jehovah let none of Samuel's prophecies fail.
1 Samuel 3:19 reads, "And Samuel continued growing up, and Jehovah himself proved to be with him, and did not cause any of all his words to fall to the earth."
Samuel called to Jehovah. Paragraph 24, question. In time, what decision did the Israelites make, and why was that a serious sin? Did the Israelites follow Samuel's lead and become spiritual, faithful people? No. In time, they decided that they did not want a mere prophet to judge them. They wanted to be like other nations and have a human king rule over them. At Jehovah's direction, Samuel complied. But he had to convey to Israel the magnitude of their sin. They were rejecting not a mere man, but Jehovah himself. So he summoned the people to Gilgal. Paragraphs 25 and 26, question. At Gilgal, how did elderly Samuel finally help his people to see the seriousness of their sin against Jehovah? Let us rejoin him in that tense moment of addressing Israel at Gilgal. There, elderly Samuel reminded Israel of his faithful record of integrity. Then we read, Samuel called to Jehovah. 1 Samuel 12:17 and 18. He asked Jehovah for a thunderstorm. A thunderstorm? In the dry season? Why, such a thing was unheard of. If there was even a trace of skepticism or scoffing among the people, it did not last long. The sky suddenly darkened with clouds. The winds battered the wheat in the fields. The thunder let out its booming, deafening roars, and the rain fell. The response? The people were greatly in fear of Jehovah and of Samuel. 1 Samuel 12:18 and 19. At last they saw how seriously they had sinned. Paragraph 27, question. How does Jehovah feel about those who imitate the faith of Samuel? Not Samuel, but his God Jehovah had reached their rebellious hearts. From his youth to his old age, Samuel put faith in his God, and Jehovah rewarded him. To this day, Jehovah has not changed. He still supports those who imitate the faith of Samuel. Questions to think about. What helped Samuel's faith to grow during his youth? How did Samuel's faith enable him to resist bad influences? How did Samuel's faith help him to overcome fear? What are some ways that you would like to imitate the faith of Samuel? Chapter 8. He endured despite disappointments. Paragraph 1. Question. Why was Shiloh full of grief and mourning? Samuel could feel the grief in Shiloh. It almost seemed that the town was awash in tears. From how many houses did the cries of women and children emanate, the sounds of grieving over the news about fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers who would not be coming home? We know only that Israel had lost some 30,000 soldiers in a terrible defeat at the hands of the Philistines not long after the loss of 4,000 in another battle. Paragraphs 2 and 3. Question. What string of tragedies had brought shame and loss of glory to Shiloh? That was just part of a string of tragedies. High priest Eli's two wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had marched out of Shiloh with the sacred Ark of the Covenant. Usually housed in the holy compartment of the tabernacle, a tent-like temple, this precious chest was a symbol of God's presence. The people then took the ark into battle, foolishly thinking that it would act as a talisman and give them victory. But the Philistines captured the ark, killing Hophni and Phinehas. The tabernacle in Shiloh had been honored with the presence of the ark for centuries. Now it was gone. Upon hearing this news, 98-year-old Eli fell backward from his seat and died. His daughter-in-law, widowed that very day, died in childbirth. Before expiring, she said, "Glory has gone away from Israel into exile." 1 Samuel 4:12-22. Indeed, Shiloh would never be the same. Paragraph 4. Question. What will we discuss in this chapter? How would Samuel cope with these profound disappointments? Would his faith stand up to the challenge of helping a people who had lost Jehovah's protection and favor? All of us today may, at times, face hardships and disappointments that challenge our faith. So let us see what more we can learn from Samuel. He effected righteousness. Paragraphs 5 and 6. Question. What does the Bible record focus on regarding a 20-year period? And how was Samuel occupied during that time? The Bible record turns away from Samuel at this point and follows the sacred ark, showing us how the Philistines suffered for taking it and were forced to return it. When we again come upon Samuel, some 20 years have passed. How was he occupied during those years? We need not guess. We learn that before this period began, the word of Samuel continued to come to all Israel. 1 Samuel 4:1. The record reveals that after the period was over, Samuel made a custom of visiting 3 cities in Israel, making a circuit each year, handling disputes and resolving questions. Then he would return to his hometown of Ramah. Clearly, Samuel always kept busy, and during that 20-year interval, he had much to do. Paragraphs 7 and 8. Question A. What message did Samuel deliver to the people after 2 decades of hard work? Question B. How did the people respond to Samuel's assurance? The immorality and corruption of Eli's sons had eroded the people's faith. Many, it seems, turned to idolatry as a result. After 2 decades of hard work, though, Samuel delivered this message to the people. If it is with all your heart you are returning to Jehovah, put away the foreign gods from your midst, and also the Ashtoreth images, and direct your heart unswervingly to Jehovah, and serve him alone, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. 1 Samuel 7:3. The hand of the Philistines had grown heavy on the people. With Israel's army effectively smashed, the Philistines felt that they could oppress God's people with impunity. But Samuel assured the people that things would change if only they returned to Jehovah. Were they willing? To Samuel's delight, they put away their idols and began serving Jehovah alone. Samuel convened an assembly at Mizpah, a town in the mountainous country north of Jerusalem. The people gathered, fasted, and repented for their many sins of idolatry.
1 Samuel 7:4-6 reads, At that the sons of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreth images and began serving Jehovah alone. Then Samuel said, Collect all Israel together at Mizpah, that I may pray in your behalf to Jehovah. So they were collected together at Mizpah, and they went drawing water and pouring it out before Jehovah, and kept a fast on that day. And they began saying there, We have sinned against Jehovah. And Samuel took up judging the sons of Israel in Mizpah.
Paragraph 9. Question. The Philistines saw what opportunity, and how did God's people respond to the danger? However, the Philistines learned of this great gathering and saw an opportunity. They sent their army to Mizpah to crush those worshippers of Jehovah. The Israelites heard news of the approaching danger. Terrified, they asked Samuel to pray for them. He did so, offering a sacrifice as well. During that sacred ceremony, the Philistine army came up against Mizpah. Jehovah then answered Samuel's prayer. In effect, Jehovah let out a roar of indignation. He caused it to thunder with a loud noise on that day against the Philistines. 1 Samuel 7:7-10. Paragraphs 10 and 11. Question A. Why must there have been something unusual about the thunder that Jehovah directed against the Philistine army? Question B. What resulted from the battle that began at Mizpah? Now, should we imagine that those Philistines were like little children who scurry in fear to hide behind their mothers when they hear a thunderclap? No, these were tough, battle-hardened soldiers. This thunder, then, must have been unlike anything they knew. Was it the sheer volume of this loud noise? Did it come out of a clear blue sky? Or did it echo bafflingly from the hillsides? At any rate, it shook those Philistines to the core. In utter confusion, they changed quickly from bullies to targets. The men of Israel poured forth from Mizpah, defeated them, and chased them for miles to a place southwest of Jerusalem. That battle was a turning point. The Philistines kept retreating during the rest of Samuel's days as judge. City after city returned to the control of God's people. Paragraph 12. Question. What does it mean that Samuel effected righteousness, and what qualities helped him to remain effective? Many centuries later, the Apostle Paul listed Samuel among the faithful judges and prophets who effected righteousness. Samuel did indeed help to bring about what was good and right in God's eyes. He remained effective because he waited patiently on Jehovah, faithfully keeping at his work in spite of disappointments. He also showed an appreciative spirit. After the victory at Mizpah, Samuel had a monument erected to commemorate the way that Jehovah had helped his people. Paragraph 13. Question A. What qualities do we need if we are to imitate Samuel? Question B. When do you think is a good time to develop traits like those of Samuel? Do you want to effect righteousness? If so, you do well to learn from Samuel's patience and his humble, appreciative spirit.
1 Peter 5:6 reads, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time."
Who of us does not need those qualities? It was good for Samuel to acquire and display such traits when relatively young, for he faced deeper disappointments in his later years. Your own sons have not walked in your ways. Paragraphs 14 and 15, Question A. What severe disappointment did Samuel face after he had grown old? Question B. Was Samuel a reprehensible father in the manner of Eli? Explain. The next time we see Samuel, he had grown old. 1 Samuel 8, 1-3. Samuel had 2 adult sons by this time, Joel and Abijah, and he entrusted them with the responsibility of helping him in the work of judging. Sadly, though, his trust was misplaced. Honest and righteous though Samuel was, his sons used their positions for selfish ends, perverting justice and taking bribes. One day, the older men of Israel approached the elderly prophet to complain. "Your own sons have not walked in your ways," they said. 1 Samuel 8, 4 and 5. Was Samuel aware of the problem? The account does not say. Unlike Eli, however, Samuel was surely not a reprehensible father. Jehovah had rebuked and punished Eli for failing to correct his son's wickedness, for honoring his sons more than God. Jehovah never found such fault with Samuel. Paragraph 16. Question. What feelings afflict parents of rebellious children? And how might parents find a measure of comfort and guidance in Samuel's example? The account does not reveal Samuel's agonizing shame, anxiety, or disappointment once he learned of his son's wicked conduct. Many parents, however, can imagine his feelings only too well. In today's dark times, rebellion against parental authority and discipline is pandemic.
2 Timothy 3:1-5 reads, "But know this, that in the last days critical times hard to deal with will be here. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, self-assuming, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, not open to any agreement, slanderers, without self-control, fierce, without love of goodness, betrayers, headstrong, puffed up with pride, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God, having a form of godly devotion, but proving false to its power, and from these turn away."
Parents who are dealing with that kind of pain may find a measure of comfort and guidance in Samuel's example. He did not let his son's faithless ways alter his own course one bit. Remember, even after words and discipline fail to reach hardened hearts, parental example remains a powerful teacher. And parents always have the opportunity to make their own father, Jehovah God, proud, as did Samuel. Do appoint for us a king. Paragraph 17. Question. What did the older men of Israel demand of Samuel, and how did he react? Samuel's sons could not have imagined how far the effects of their greed and selfishness would reach. The older men of Israel went on to say to Samuel, "Now do appoint for us a king to judge us, like all the nations." Did that demand feel like a rejection to Samuel? After all, he had been judging those people on Jehovah's behalf for decades. Now they wanted not some mere prophet like Samuel, but a king to be their judge. The nations round about had kings, and the Israelites wanted one too. How did Samuel react? We read that the thing was bad in the eyes of Samuel. 1 Samuel 8, 5 and 6. Paragraph 18. Question. How did Jehovah comfort Samuel and yet reveal the seriousness of Israel's sin? Note how Jehovah responded when Samuel took the matter to him in prayer. Listen to the voice of the people as respects all that they say to you. For it is not you whom they have rejected, but it is I whom they have rejected from being king over them. How comforting for Samuel! Yet how awful an insult those people had flung at Almighty God! Jehovah told his prophet to warn the Israelites of the high price they would pay for having a human king. When Samuel complied, they insisted, "No, but a king is what will come to be over us." 1 Samuel 8, 7 through 19. Ever obedient to his God, Samuel went and anointed the king whom Jehovah chose. Paragraphs 19 and 20. Question A. In what ways did Samuel obey Jehovah's direction to anoint Saul as king of Israel? Question B. How did Samuel continue to help Jehovah's people? How, though, did Samuel obey? In a resentful, perfunctory way? Did he allow disappointment to poison his heart, letting bitterness take root? Many a man might respond that way in such a situation, but not Samuel. He anointed Saul and acknowledged that the man was Jehovah's own choice. He kissed Saul, a sign of welcome and submission to the new king. And he said to the people, "Have you seen the one whom Jehovah has chosen, that there is none like him among all the people?" 1 Samuel 10, 1 and 24. Samuel focused not on faults, but on the good in the man whom Jehovah had chosen. As for himself, he focused on his own record of integrity to God rather than on the approval of fickle people. He also worked faithfully at his own assignment, counseling God's people about the spiritual dangers they faced and encouraging them to remain faithful to Jehovah. His counsel reached their hearts, and the people begged Samuel to pray in their behalf. He gave them this beautiful reply: "It is unthinkable on my part to sin against Jehovah by ceasing to pray in your behalf, and I must instruct you in the good and right way." 1 Samuel 12, 21 through 24. Paragraph 21. Question. How might Samuel's example prove helpful if you ever feel disappointed when someone else receives a position or privilege? Have you ever felt disappointed when someone else was chosen for a certain position or privilege? Samuel's example is a powerful reminder that we must never let jealousy or bitterness take root in our heart.
Proverbs 14:30 reads, "A calm heart is the life of the fleshly organism, but jealousy is rottenness to the bones."
God has plenty of rewarding, fulfilling work for each of his faithful servants. For how long will you be mourning for Saul? Paragraph 22. Question. Why was Samuel right to see good in Saul initially? Samuel was right to see good in Saul. This was a remarkable man. Tall and impressive in appearance, he was courageous and resourceful, yet initially modest and unassuming. In addition to such gifts, he had a precious one, free will, the ability to choose his life course and make his own decisions. Did he use that gift well? Paragraph 23. Question. What precious quality did Saul lose first, and how did he show his growing arrogance? Sadly, when a man basks in the warm glow of newly acquired power, modesty is often the first quality to melt away. Before long, Saul began to turn arrogant. He chose to disobey Jehovah's orders that Samuel transmitted to him. Once Saul grew impatient and offered up a sacrifice that Samuel intended to offer. Samuel had to give him strong correction and foretold that the kingship would not remain in Saul's family. Instead of being chastened by the discipline, Saul went on to commit worse acts of disobedience. Paragraph 24. Question A. How did Saul disobey Jehovah in the war against the Amalekites? Question B. How did Saul respond to correction, and what was Jehovah's decision? Through Samuel, Jehovah told Saul to wage war against the Amalekites. Jehovah's instructions included an order to execute their wicked king Agag. However, Saul spared Agag as well as the best of the spoil, which was to be destroyed. When Samuel came to correct him, Saul revealed how much he had changed. Instead of modestly accepting correction, he rationalized, excused himself, justified his actions, sidestepped the issue, and tried to shift the blame to the people. When Saul tried to deflect the discipline by claiming that some of the spoil was intended for a sacrifice to Jehovah, Samuel uttered the famous words, "Look, to obey is better than a sacrifice." 1 Samuel 15, 1-33. Courageously, Samuel rebuked the man and revealed Jehovah's decision: the kingship would be ripped away from Saul and given to another, a better man. The footnote reads, Samuel himself executed Agag. Neither that wicked king nor his family deserved leniency. Centuries later, Agag's descendants evidently included Haman, the Agagite, who attempted to wipe out all of God's people. End of footnote. Paragraphs 25 and 26. Question A. Why did Samuel mourn for Saul, and how did Jehovah gently reprove his prophet? Question B. What lesson did Samuel learn when he went to the house of Jesse? Samuel was deeply upset over Saul's failings. He spent the night crying out to Jehovah about the matter. He even went into mourning for the man. Samuel had seen so much potential in Saul, so much good, and now such hopes were shattered. The man he once knew had changed. He had lost his best qualities and turned against Jehovah. Samuel refused to see Saul ever again. In time, though, Jehovah offered Samuel this gentle reproof. For how long will you be mourning for Saul, while I, on the other hand, have rejected him from ruling as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I shall send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, because I have provided among his sons a king for myself. 1 Samuel 16:1. Jehovah's purpose does not depend on the wavering loyalties of imperfect humans. If one man turns unfaithful, Jehovah will find another to carry out his will. So aged Samuel let go of his grief over Saul. At Jehovah's direction, Samuel went to the home of Jesse in Bethlehem, where he met a number of Jesse's impressive-looking sons. Yet, from the first, Jehovah reminded Samuel to look beyond mere physical attributes.
1 Samuel 16:7 reads, But Jehovah said to Samuel, Do not look at his appearance and at the height of his stature, for I have rejected him. For not the way man sees is the way God sees, because mere man sees what appears to the eyes, but as for Jehovah, he sees what the heart is.
Finally, Samuel met the youngest son, and here was Jehovah's choice, David. Paragraph 27. Question A. What helped Samuel's faith to keep growing stronger? Question B. How do you feel about the example that Samuel set? In his final years, Samuel got to see ever more clearly the rightness of Jehovah's decision to replace Saul with David. Saul descended into murderous jealousy and apostasy. David, however, showed beautiful qualities: courage, integrity, faith, and loyalty. As Samuel's life drew to a close, his faith grew ever stronger. He saw that no disappointment is too great for Jehovah to heal, to resolve, or even to turn into a blessing. Finally, Samuel died, leaving behind the record of a remarkable life that spanned the better part of a century. All of Israel mourned the loss of that faithful man, and no wonder. To this day, servants of Jehovah do well to ask, "Will I imitate the faith of Samuel?" Questions to think about. How did Samuel cope with the tragedies that befell Shiloh? What enabled Samuel to endure despite the rebellion of his sons? How did Samuel recover from disappointments regarding King Saul? In what ways would you like to imitate the faith of Samuel?
Chapter 9. She acted with discretion. Paragraphs 1 through 3, question A. How did danger come to loom over Abigail's household? Question B. What will we learn about this remarkable woman? Abigail saw the panic in the young man's eyes. He was terrified, and for good reason. Grave danger loomed. Right at that moment, some 400 warriors were on the way, determined to kill off every male in the household of Nabal, Abigail's husband. Why? It had all started with Nabal. He had acted cruelly and insolently, as usual. This time, though, he had insulted the wrong man, the beloved commander of a loyal and well-trained band of warriors. Now, one of Nabal's young workmen, perhaps a shepherd, came to Abigail trusting that she would come up with a plan to save them. But what could one woman do against an army? First, let us learn a little more about this remarkable woman. Who was Abigail? How had this crisis arisen? And what can we learn from her example of faith? Good in discretion and beautiful in form. Paragraph 4, question. What kind of man was Nabal? Abigail and Nabal were not a good match. Nabal could hardly have chosen a better spouse, whereas Abigail found herself married to one who could hardly have been worse. Granted, the man had money. He thus saw himself as very important, but how did others view him? It would be difficult to find a Bible character who was spoken of in more contemptuous terms. His very name means senseless or stupid. Did his parents give him such a name at birth, or was it an epithet that stuck to him later? In either case, he lived up to his name. Nabal was harsh and bad in his practices. 1 Samuel 25, 2, 3, 17, 21, and 25. A bully and a drunkard, he was widely feared and disliked. Paragraphs 5 and 6, question A. What do you think were Abigail's most appealing qualities? Question B. Why might Abigail have married such a good-for-nothing man? Abigail was altogether different from Nabal. Her name means, "My father has made himself joyful." Many a father is proud to have a beautiful daughter, but a wise father is far happier to discern inner beauty in his child. All too often, a person blessed with outward beauty fails to see the need to develop such qualities as discretion, wisdom, courage, or faith. Not so with Abigail. The Bible praises her for her discretion as well as for her beauty. 1 Samuel 25:3 reads, And the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the wife was good in discretion and beautiful in form, but the husband was harsh and bad in his practices, and he was a Calebite.
Some today might wonder why such an intelligent young woman married such a good-for-nothing man. Remember, many marriages in Bible times were arranged. If not, parental consent was still of great importance. Did Abigail's parents favor this marriage, even arrange it, because they were impressed with Nabal's wealth and prominence? Did they feel pressured by poverty? At any rate, Nabal's money did not make him a fit husband. Paragraph 7, question A. What should parents today avoid if they want to teach their children a wholesome view of marriage? Question B. What was Abigail determined to do? Wise parents carefully teach their children a wholesome view of marriage. They neither urge their children to marry for money, nor pressure them to begin dating when still too young to take on adult roles and responsibilities. However, it was too late for Abigail to think about such things. For whatever reason, she was married to Nabal, and she was determined to make the best of a difficult situation. He screamed rebukes at them. Paragraph 8, question. Whom had Nabal insulted, and why would you say that this was most unwise? Nabal had just made Abigail's situation harder than ever. The man he had insulted was none other than David. This was the faithful servant of Jehovah, whom Samuel the prophet had anointed, revealing David as God's choice to succeed Saul as king. On the run from the jealous and murderous King Saul, David was dwelling in the wilderness with his 600 loyal warriors. Paragraphs 9 and 10, question A. David and his men were struggling to survive in what setting? Question B. Why should Nabal have appreciated what David and his men had been doing? Nabal lived in Maon, but worked and likely owned land in nearby Carmel. The footnote reads, This was not the famous Mount Carmel far to the north where the prophet Elijah later had a showdown with the prophets of Baal. This Carmel was a town at the edge of the southern wilderness. End of footnote. Those towns lay amidst grassy uplands suitable for raising sheep, of which Nabal owned 3,000. All around, though, was wild country. To the south lay the vast wilderness of Paran. To the east, the approach to the Salt Sea led through desolate wastelands riddled with ravines and caves. In these regions, David and his men struggled to survive, no doubt hunting for their food and enduring many hardships. They often encountered the young men who worked as shepherds for the wealthy Nabal. How did those hard-working soldiers treat the shepherds? It would have been easy for them to help themselves to a sheep now and then, but they did nothing of the kind. On the contrary, they were like a protective wall around Nabal's flocks and servants.
1 Samuel 25:15 and 16 reads, And the men were very good to us, and they did not molest us, and we did not miss a single thing all the days of our walking about with them while we happened to be in the field. A wall was what they proved to be around us, both by night and by day, all the days that we happened to be with them, shepherding the flock.
Sheep and shepherds faced plenty of dangers. Predators abounded, and Israel's southern border was so close that bands of foreign marauders and thieves frequently attacked. The footnote reads, David likely felt that protecting the local landowners and their flocks was a service to Jehovah God. In those days, it was Jehovah's purpose for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to dwell in that land. Protecting it from foreign invaders and marauding bands was thus a form of sacred service. End of footnote. Paragraphs 11 and 12, question A. How did David show tact and respect in his message to Nabal? Question B. What was wrong with the way Nabal responded to David's message? It must have been quite an undertaking to keep all those men fed in the wilderness. So one day David sent 10 messengers to Nabal to ask for help. David chose the moment wisely. It was the festive time of sheep shearing, when generosity and feasting were customary. David also chose his words with care, using polite terms and forms of address. He even referred to himself as your son David, perhaps a respectful acknowledgement of Nabal's greater age. 1 Samuel 25, 5-8. How did Nabal respond? He was outraged. He screamed rebukes at them, is how the young man mentioned at the outset described the scene to Abigail. 1 Samuel 25, 10, 11, and 14. Miserly Nabal complained loudly about his precious bread, water, and slaughtered meat. He ridiculed David as inconsequential and compared him to a runaway servant. Nabal's view may have been similar to that of Saul, who hated David. Neither man had Jehovah's view. God loved David and saw him not as a rebellious slave, but as the future king of Israel. Paragraph 13, question A. How did David initially respond to Nabal's insult? Question B. What light does the principle recorded at James 1:20 shed on David's reaction? When the emissaries reported back to David, he became furious. "Gird on every one his sword," he commanded. 1 Samuel 25, 12, 13, 21, and 22. Arming himself, David led 400 of his men to attack. He vowed to wipe out every male in Nabal's household. David's ire was understandable, but his way of expressing it was wrong. The Bible says, "Man's wrath does not work out God's righteousness." James 1:20. How, though, could Abigail save her household? Blessed be your sensibleness. Paragraph 14, question A. In what way did Abigail take the first step toward righting the wrong that Nabal had committed? Question B. What practical lesson might we learn from the contrast between Nabal and Abigail? In a way, we have already seen Abigail take the first step toward righting this terrible wrong. Unlike her husband Nabal, she proved willing to listen. As for bringing the matter to Nabal, the young servant said of him, "He is too much of a good-for-nothing fellow to speak to him." 1 Samuel 25:17. The footnote reads, the phrase the young man used literally means a son of Belial, worthlessness. Other Bible renderings of this sentence include a description of Nabal as a man who won't listen to anyone, and the conclusion, it is no good talking to him. End of footnote. Tragically, Nabal's view of his own importance rendered him unwilling to listen. Such arrogance is all too common even to this day. But the young man knew Abigail to be different, which is no doubt why he approached her with this problem. Paragraphs 15 and 16, question A. How did Abigail show that she was like the capable wife described in the book of Proverbs? Question B. Why was Abigail's course not a case of rebelling against her husband's rightful headship? Abigail thought and acted quickly. At once Abigail hastened, we read. 4 times in this one account we find the same verb, to hasten, used regarding this woman. She prepared a generous gift for David and his men. It included bread, wine, sheep, roasted grain, cakes of raisins, and cakes of figs. Clearly, Abigail knew well what she had and was thoroughly in charge of her household responsibilities, much like the capable wife later described in the book of Proverbs. She sent the provisions ahead with some of her servants, then followed alone. But, we read, to her husband Nabal she told nothing. 1 Samuel 25, 18 and 19. Does this mean that Abigail was rebelling against her husband's rightful headship? No. Keep in mind that Nabal had acted wickedly against an anointed servant of Jehovah, an action that could well result in death for many innocent members of Nabal's household. If Abigail failed to act, might she become a sharer in her husband's guilt? In this case, she had to put submission to her God ahead of submission to her husband. Paragraphs 17 and 18 question: how did Abigail approach David? What did she say? And what made her words effective? Before long, Abigail met up with David and his men. Again she hastened, this time to descend from her donkey and humble herself before David. Then she poured out her heart at length, making a powerful plea for mercy in behalf of her husband and her household. What made her words effective? She took responsibility for the problem and asked David to forgive her personally. She realistically acknowledged that her husband was as senseless as his name implied, perhaps suggesting that it would be beneath David's dignity to chastise such a man. She expressed her trust in David as Jehovah's representative, recognizing that he was fighting the wars of Jehovah. She also indicated that she knew of Jehovah's promise regarding David and the kingship, for she said, "Jehovah certainly will commission you as leader over Israel." Further, she urged David not to take any action that might bring blood guilt upon him or that might later become a cause for staggering, evidently referring to a troubled conscience.
1 Samuel 25:24-31 reads, "She then fell at his feet and said, 'Upon me myself, O my Lord, be the error, and please let your slave girl speak in your ears, and listen to the words of your slave girl. Please do not let my Lord set his heart upon this good-for-nothing man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and senselessness is with him. As for me, your slave girl, I did not see my Lord's young men that you had sent. And now, my Lord, as Jehovah is living and as your soul is living, Jehovah has held you back from entering into blood guilt and having your own hand come to your salvation. And now let your enemies and those seeking injury to my Lord become like Nabal. And now, as regards this gift blessing that your maidservant has brought to my Lord, it must be given to the young men that are walking about in the steps of my Lord. Pardon, please, the transgression of your slave girl, because Jehovah will without fail make for my Lord a lasting house, because the wars of Jehovah are what my Lord is fighting. And as for badness, it will not be found in you throughout your days. When man rises up to pursue you and look for your soul, the soul of my Lord will certainly prove to be wrapped up in the bag of life with Jehovah your God. But as for the soul of your enemies, he will sling it forth as from inside the hollow of the sling. And it must occur that, because Jehovah will do to my Lord the good toward you according to all that he has spoken, he certainly will commission you as leader over Israel. And let this not become to you a cause for staggering or a stumbling block to the heart of my Lord, both by the shedding of blood without cause and by having the hand of my Lord itself come to his salvation. And Jehovah will certainly do good to my Lord, and you must remember your slave girl."
Kind, moving words. Paragraph 19 question: how did David respond to Abigail's words, and why did he praise her? And how did David respond? He accepted what Abigail had brought and said, "Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Israel, who has sent you this day to meet me. And blessed be your sensibleness, and blessed be you who have restrained me this day from entering into blood guilt." David praised her for bravely hastening to meet him, and he acknowledged that she had restrained him from incurring blood guilt. "Go up in peace to your house," he told her, and he humbly added, "I have listened to your voice." 1 Samuel 25:32-35. Here is your slave girl. Paragraphs 20 and 21, question A. What do you find admirable about Abigail's willingness to return to her husband? Question B. How did Abigail show courage and discretion in choosing the time to talk to Nabal? After she took her leave, Abigail could not help thinking about that meeting, nor could she have failed to notice the contrast between that faithful, kind man and the brute to whom she was married. But she did not dwell on such thoughts. We read, later Abigail came in to Nabal. 1 Samuel 25:36. Yes, she returned to her husband as determined as ever to carry out her role as his wife to the best of her ability. She had to tell him of the gift she had given to David and his men. He had a right to know. She also had to tell him, before he learned of it elsewhere, to his even greater shame, about the danger that had been averted. She could not tell him now, though. He was feasting like a king and was as drunk as could be. Again, showing both courage and discretion, she waited until the next morning when the influence of the wine had ebbed. He would be sober enough to understand her, yet possibly more dangerous in his temper as well. Still, she approached and told him the whole story. No doubt she expected him to explode in fury, perhaps violence. Instead, he just sat there, not moving. Paragraph 22, question. What happened to Nabal? And what can we learn about all cases of domestic tyranny or abuse? What was wrong with the man? His heart came to be dead inside him, and he himself became as a stone. Perhaps he had suffered some form of stroke. However, about 10 days later, his end came, and not strictly for medical reasons. The account tells us Jehovah struck Nabal so that he died. 1 Samuel 25:38. With that righteous execution, Abigail's long nightmare of a marriage was over. While Jehovah does not step in with miraculous executions today, this account is a fitting reminder that no case of domestic tyranny or abuse escapes his notice. In his own time, he will always bring about justice.
Luke 8:17 reads, For there is nothing hidden that will not become manifest, neither anything carefully concealed that will never become known and never come into the open.
Paragraph 23, question. What further blessing came to Abigail, and how did she show that her new prospects did not change her? Besides the release from a bad marriage, Abigail had another blessing in store. When he learned of the death of Nabal, David sent messengers to propose marriage. Here is your slave girl, she responded, as a maidservant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. 1 Samuel 25:39-42. Clearly, she was not changed by the prospect of becoming David's wife. She even offered to be a servant to his servants. Then we read again of her hastening, this time to ready herself to go to David. Paragraph 24, question. Abigail faced what challenges in her new life? But how did her husband and her God view her? This was no fairy tale ending. Abigail's life with David would not always be easy. David was already married to Ahinoam, and though God permitted polygamy, it surely presented special challenges to faithful women back then. And David was not yet king. There would be obstacles and hardships to surmount before he served Jehovah in that way. But as Abigail helped and supported David along life's road, eventually bearing him a son, she learned that she had a husband who valued her and protected her. On one occasion, he even rescued her from kidnappers. David thus imitated Jehovah God, who loves and values such discreet, courageous, and faithful women. questions to think about. What can we learn from Abigail's difficult marital situation? How did Abigail show courage and discretion in dealing with her husband's insult of David? How did Abigail speak sensibly and persuasively to David? In what ways would you like to imitate the faith of Abigail? Chapter 12. He took comfort in his God. Paragraphs 1 and 2 question, what happened on the most eventful day of Elijah's life? Elijah ran through the rain as the darkness deepened. He had a long way to go before he would reach Jezreel, and he was no young man. Yet he ran on tirelessly, for the very hand of Jehovah was upon him. The energy coursing through his body was surely unlike any he had ever known. Why, he had just outpaced the team of horses that was pulling King Ahab in his royal chariot.
1 Kings 18:46 reads, "And the very hand of Jehovah proved to be upon Elijah, so that he girded up his hips and went running ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel."
Now the open road lay before him. Imagine Elijah blinking the raindrops from his eyes as he ran, thinking back over the most eventful day of his life. Without question, it was a glorious victory for Elijah's God Jehovah and for true worship. Far behind him, lost in the gloom of the storm, lay the windswept heights of Mount Carmel, where Jehovah had used Elijah to strike a mighty and miraculous blow against Baal worship. Hundreds of Baal prophets were exposed as wicked frauds and justly executed. Then Elijah prayed to Jehovah for an end to the drought that had afflicted the land for 3.5 years. The rains fell. Paragraphs 3 and 4 question A. Why might Elijah's hopes have been high as he made his way to Jezreel? Question B. What questions will we consider? As Elijah splashed along those 19 miles to Jezreel, his hopes might have been high. It may have seemed to him that a real turning point had come at last. Ahab would have to change. After what he had witnessed, surely he had no choice but to abandon Baal worship, to restrain his queen Jezebel, and to stop the persecution of Jehovah's servants. When things seem to be going our way, it is only natural that our hopes rise. We may imagine that our lot in life will continue to improve, perhaps even thinking that our worst problems are finally behind us. If Elijah thought that way, no wonder, for he was a man with feelings like ours. James 5:17. Actually, though, Elijah's problems were far from over. In fact, within hours, Elijah would be so fearful, so low in spirits, that he would wish to die. What happened, and how did Jehovah help his prophet to renew his faith and his courage? Let us see. An unexpected turn of events. Paragraph 5 question. After the events on Mount Carmel, had Ahab learned to respect Jehovah more, and how do we know? When Ahab reached his palace in Jezreel, did he give any evidence of being a changed man? We read, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and all about how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. 1 Kings 19:1. Notice that Ahab's account of the day's events left out Elijah's God Jehovah. A fleshly man, Ahab saw the day's miraculous events in strictly human terms, what Elijah had done. Clearly, he had not learned to respect Jehovah God. And how did his vengeful wife react? Paragraph 6 question. What message did Jezebel send to Elijah, and what did it mean? Jezebel was furious. Livid with rage, she sent this message to Elijah. So may the gods do, and so may they add to it, if at this time tomorrow I shall not make your soul like the soul of each one of them. 1 Kings 19:2. This was a death threat of the worst kind. In effect, Jezebel was vowing that she herself should die if she could not have Elijah killed within the day to avenge her Baal prophets. Imagine Elijah being awakened from sleep in some humble lodging in Jezreel on that stormy night, only to hear the queen's messenger deliver those awful words. How was he affected? Overcome by discouragement and fear. Paragraph 7 question: what effect did Jezebel's threat have on Elijah, and what did he do? If Elijah cherished any notions that the war against Baal worship was all but over, his hopes came crashing down at that moment. Jezebel was undeterred. A great many of Elijah's faithful colleagues had already been executed on her orders, and now, it seemed, he was to be next. What effect did Jezebel's threat have on Elijah? The Bible tells us he became afraid. Did Elijah picture in his mind's eye the terrible death that Jezebel had in store for him? If he dwelled on such thoughts, it is no wonder that his courage failed him. At any rate, Elijah began to go for his soul. He ran for his life. 1 Kings 19:3. Paragraph 8, question A. How was Peter's problem similar to that of Elijah? Question B. What lesson can we learn from Elijah and Peter? Elijah was not the only man of faith ever to be overcome by fear. Much later, the Apostle Peter had a similar problem. For instance, when Jesus enabled Peter to join him in walking on water, the apostle began looking at the windstorm. He then lost his courage and started to sink.
Matthew 14:30 reads, "But looking at the windstorm, he got afraid, and after starting to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!'"
The examples of Elijah and Peter thus teach us a valuable lesson. If we want to maintain our courage, we must not let our mind dwell on the dangers that frighten us. We need to keep our focus on the source of our hope and strength. It is enough. Paragraph 9. Describe Elijah's journey and his state of mind as he fled. Driven by fear, Elijah fled southwestward some 95 miles to Beersheba, a town near the southern border of Judah. There he left his attendant behind and struck out into the wilderness alone. The record says that he went a day's journey, so we may picture him starting off at sunrise, evidently carrying no provisions with him. 1 Kings 19:4. Depressed, spurred ever onward by fear, he struggled over the rough and wild terrain under the blazing sun. As that glaring disk gradually reddened and sank to the horizon, Elijah's strength gave out. Exhausted, he sat down under a broom tree, the closest thing to shelter in that barren landscape. Paragraphs 10 and 11, question A. What was the meaning of Elijah's prayer to Jehovah? Part B. Using the cited scriptures, describe the feelings of other godly individuals who became low in spirits. Elijah prayed in utter desperation. He asked to die. He said, "I am no better than my forefathers." He knew that his forefathers were then mere dust and bones in the grave, unable to do any good for anybody. Elijah felt just as worthless. No wonder he cried out, "It is enough!" Why go on living? Should it be shocking to learn that a man of God could become so low in spirits? Not necessarily. A number of faithful men and women in the Bible record are described as feeling so sad that they wished for death. Among them, Rebekah, Jacob, Moses, and Job. Paragraph 12, question. If you ever find yourself feeling very low, in what respect should you follow Elijah's example? Today we live in critical times hard to deal with, So it is not surprising that many people, even faithful servants of God, find themselves feeling low at times. 2 Timothy 3:1. If you ever find yourself in such a dire situation, follow Elijah's example in this respect. Pour out your feelings to God. After all, Jehovah is the God of all comfort.
2 Corinthians 1:3 and 4 reads, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of tender mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those in any sort of tribulation through the comfort with which we ourselves are being comforted by God.
Did he comfort Elijah? Jehovah sustained his prophet. Paragraphs 13 and 14, question A. How did Jehovah, by means of an angel, show loving concern for his troubled prophet? Question B. Why is it comforting that Jehovah knows all about each one of us, including our limitations? How do you think Jehovah felt as he looked down from heaven and saw his beloved prophet lying under that tree in the wilderness and begging for death to take him? We do not have to guess. After Elijah sank into sleep, Jehovah sent an angel to him. The angel gently woke Elijah with a touch and said, Rise up, eat. Elijah did so, for the angel had kindly set out a simple meal for him, fresh, warm bread along with water. Did he even thank the angel? The record says only that the prophet ate and drank and went back to sleep. Was he too despondent to speak? At any rate, the angel woke him a second time, perhaps at dawn. Once more he urged Elijah, Rise up, eat. And he added these remarkable words, For the journey is too much for you. 1 Kings 19:5-7. Thanks to God-given insight, the angel knew where Elijah was headed. He also knew that the journey would be too much for Elijah to carry out in his own strength. What a comfort to serve a God who knows our goals and our limitations better than we do.
Psalm 103:13 and 14 reads, As a father shows mercy to his sons, Jehovah has shown mercy to those fearing him. For he himself well knows the formation of us, remembering that we are dust.
How did Elijah benefit from that meal? Paragraphs 15 and 16, question A. What did nourishment from Jehovah enable Elijah to do? Question B. Why should we appreciate the way that Jehovah sustains his servants today? We read, He rose up and ate and drank, and he kept going in the power of that nourishment for 40 days and 40 nights, as far as the mountain of the true God Horeb. 1 Kings 19:8. Like Moses some 6 centuries before him, and Jesus nearly 10 centuries after him, Elijah fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. That one meal did not make all his problems go away, but it sustained him miraculously. Imagine that older man trudging through the trackless wilderness day after day, week after week, for nearly a month and a half. Jehovah sustains his servants today as well, not with miraculous physical meals, but in a far more vital way. He provides for his servants spiritually. Learning about God from his word and from publications that are carefully based on the Bible sustains us spiritually. Taking in such spiritual nourishment may not make all our problems go away, but it can help us endure what might otherwise be unendurable. It also leads to everlasting life. Paragraph 17, question. Where did Elijah go, and why was that place significant? Elijah walked nearly 200 miles until he finally reached Mount Horeb. It was a place of great significance, for there Jehovah God, through an angel, had long before appeared to Moses in the burning thorn bush, and there Jehovah had later made the law covenant with Israel. Elijah found shelter in a cave. How Jehovah comforted and strengthened his prophet. Paragraphs 18 and 19, question A. Jehovah's spirit messenger posed what question, and how did Elijah respond? Question B. Elijah revealed what 3 reasons for his low spirits? At Horeb, Jehovah's word, evidently delivered by a spirit messenger, posed this simple question: "What is your business here, Elijah?" The question was likely spoken in a gentle way, for Elijah took it as an invitation to pour out his feelings. And pour them out he did. He said, "I have been absolutely jealous for Jehovah, the God of armies. For the sons of Israel have left your covenant. Your altars they have torn down, and your prophets they have killed with the sword, so that I only am left. And they begin looking for my soul to take it away." 1 Kings 19, 9 and 10. Elijah's words reveal at least 3 reasons for his low spirits. First, Elijah felt that his work had been in vain. Despite years of being absolutely jealous in serving Jehovah, putting God's sacred name and worship above all else, Elijah saw that conditions seemed only to have grown worse. The people were still faithless and rebellious, while false worship was running rampant. Second, Elijah felt alone. "I only am left," he said, as if in that nation he were the last man who still served Jehovah. Third, Elijah was scared. Many of his fellow prophets had already been killed, and he was convinced that he was next. It may not have been easy for Elijah to admit to those feelings, but he did not let pride or embarrassment hold him back. By opening his heart to his God in prayer, he set a good example for all faithful people. Paragraphs 20 and 21, Part A. Describe what Elijah witnessed from the mouth of the cave on Mount Horeb. Question B. What did Jehovah's displays of power teach Elijah? How did Jehovah address Elijah's fears and concerns? The angel told Elijah to stand at the mouth of the cave. He obeyed, not knowing what was in store. A mighty wind sprang up. It must have emitted a deafening roar, for it was so powerful that it tore mountains and crags apart. Picture Elijah trying to shield his eyes while clinging to his heavy rustic garment of hair as the gusts whipped it about him. Then he had to struggle to keep his footing, for the very earth began to heave and toss. An earthquake shook the region. He had barely recovered when a great fire swept through, forcing him back into the cave to shield himself from the searing heat. In each case, the account reminds us that Jehovah was not to be found within these spectacular displays of nature's power. Elijah knew that Jehovah was not some mythical nature god such as Baal, who was hailed by his deluded worshippers as the rider of the clouds or bringer of rains. Jehovah is the real source of all the awesome power found in nature, but he is also vastly greater than anything he has made. Even the physical heavens cannot contain him. How did all of this help Elijah? Remember his fear. With a God like Jehovah on his side, a God who had all that overwhelming power at his disposal, Elijah had nothing to fear from Ahab and Jezebel.
Psalm 118:6 reads, "Jehovah is on my side. I shall not fear. What can earthling man do to me?"
Paragraph 22, question A. How did the calm, low voice reassure Elijah that he was far from worthless? Question B. Who might have been the source of the calm, low voice? After the fire was gone, a hush fell, and Elijah heard a calm, low voice. It invited Elijah to express himself again, and he did so, pouring out his concerns a second time. The footnote reads, "The source of this calm, low voice may have been the same Spirit who was used to deliver Jehovah's word mentioned at 1 Kings 19:9. In verse 15, This Spirit is referred to simply as Jehovah. We might be reminded of the Spirit emissary whom Jehovah used to guide Israel in the wilderness, and of whom God said, "My name is within him." Exodus 23:21. We cannot be dogmatic on this point, of course, but it is worth noting that in his pre-human existence, Jesus served as the Word, the special spokesman to Jehovah's servants. End of footnote. Perhaps that brought him further relief. Undoubtedly, though, Elijah found even more comfort in what the calm, low voice told him next. Jehovah reassured Elijah that he was far from worthless. How so? God revealed much of his long-range purpose regarding the war against Baal worship in Israel. Clearly, Elijah's work had not been in vain, for God's purpose was moving inexorably forward. Furthermore, Elijah still figured in that purpose, for Jehovah sent him back to work with some specific instructions. Paragraph 23 question. In what two ways did Jehovah address Elijah's feelings of loneliness? What about Elijah's feelings of loneliness? Jehovah did two things about that. First, he told Elijah to anoint Elisha as the prophet who would eventually succeed him. This younger man would become Elijah's companion and helper for a number of years. How practical that comfort was. Second, Jehovah revealed this thrilling news. I have let 7,000 remain in Israel, all the knees that have not bent down to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. 1 Kings 19:18. Elijah was far from alone. It must have warmed his heart to hear of those thousands of faithful people who refused to worship Baal. They needed Elijah to keep up his faithful service, to set an example of unshakable loyalty to Jehovah in those dark times. Elijah must have been deeply touched to hear those words through Jehovah's messenger, the calm, low voice of his God. Paragraphs 24 and 25, question A. In what sense can we listen to Jehovah's calm, low voice today? Question B. Why can we be sure that Elijah accepted the comfort Jehovah gave him? Like Elijah, we may be awestruck by the immense natural forces evident in creation, and rightly so. Creation vividly reflects the power of the Creator. Jehovah still loves to use his limitless might to help his faithful servants. However, God speaks most fully to us through the pages of his Word, the Bible.
Isaiah 30:21 reads, "And your own ears will hear a word behind you saying, 'This is the way. Walk in it, you people,' in case you people should go to the right or in case you should go to the left."
In a sense, the Bible can be like that calm, low voice if we let it guide us today. In its precious pages, Jehovah corrects us, encourages us, and reassures us of his love. Did Elijah accept the comfort Jehovah gave him on Mount Horeb? Without a doubt. Soon he was back in action, once more the bold, faithful prophet who stood up against the wickedness of false worship. If we likewise take to heart the inspired words of God, the comfort from the Scriptures, we will be able to imitate the faith of Elijah. Romans 15:4. Questions to think about. What events led Elijah to become very... Chapter 13. He learned from his mistakes. Paragraphs 1 and 2, question A. What had Jonah brought on himself and the mariners on the ship? Question B. How can Jonah's story help us? Jonah wished he could shut out the terrible sounds. It was not just the fierce wind, which was shrieking through the ship's rigging, nor was it just the mountainous waves which were thundering against the sides of the vessel, making her every timber creak and groan. No, far worse to Jonah were the shouts of those mariners, the captain and his crew, as they struggled to keep the ship afloat. Jonah felt sure that those men were about to die, all because of him. What had put Jonah in such dire straits? He had made a serious mistake in his dealings with his God Jehovah. What had he done? Were matters beyond repair? The answers can teach us much. For example, Jonah's story helps us to see how even those with genuine faith can go astray, and how they can make amends. A prophet from Galilee. Paragraphs 3 through 5, question A. What do people often focus on when they think of Jonah? Question B. What do we know about Jonah's background? Question C. Why was Jonah's service as a prophet not easy or pleasant? When people think of the man Jonah, they often seem to focus on negative traits, such as his lapses into disobedience or even his hard-headedness. But there was far more to the man than that. Remember, Jonah was selected to serve as a prophet of Jehovah God. Jehovah would not have picked him for such a weighty responsibility had he been unfaithful or unrighteous. The Bible reveals a little about Jonah's background.
2 Kings 14:25 reads, He it was that restored the boundary of Israel from the entering in of Hamath clear to the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of Jehovah, the God of Israel, who spoke by means of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet that was from Gath-hepher.
He was from Gath-hepher, just 2.5 miles from Nazareth, the town where Jesus Christ would grow up some 8 centuries later. The footnote reads, Jonah's origin in a Galilean town is noteworthy because when referring to Jesus, the Pharisees arrogantly said, Search and see that no prophet is to be raised up out of Galilee. John 7:52. Many translators and researchers suggest that the Pharisees were making a sweeping generalization that no prophet had ever arisen or ever could arise out of lowly Galilee. If so, those men were ignoring history as well as prophecy. End of footnote. Jonah served as a prophet during the reign of King Jeroboam II of the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. The time of Elijah was long past. His successor, Elijah, had died during the reign of Jeroboam's father. Although Jehovah had used those men to wipe out Baal worship, Israel was willfully going astray again. The land was now under the influence of a king who continued to do what was bad in Jehovah's eyes. 2 Kings 14:24. So Jonah's service could not have been easy or pleasant. Yet he carried it out faithfully. One day, though, Jonah's life took a dramatic turn. He received an assignment from Jehovah that he found to be extremely difficult. What was Jehovah asking him to do? Get up, go to Nineveh. Paragraph 6 question. What assignment did Jehovah give to Jonah, and why may it have appeared daunting? Jehovah told Jonah, Get up, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim against her that their badness has come up before me. Jonah 1:2. It is not hard to see why this assignment might have appeared daunting. Nineveh lay some 500 miles to the east, an overland journey that would likely take about a month on foot. However, the hardships of such a trek might have seemed the easy part of the job. At Nineveh, Jonah was to deliver Jehovah's judgment message to the Assyrians, who were notoriously violent, even savage. If Jonah had seen little response among God's own people, what could he hope to see among those pagans? How would a lone servant of Jehovah fare in vast Nineveh, which would come to be called the city of bloodshed? Nahum 3:1-7. Paragraph 7 and 8, question A. Just how determined was Jonah to get away from the assignment that Jehovah had given him? Question B. Why should we not judge Jonah a coward? Such thoughts may well have occurred to Jonah. We do not know. What we do know is that he ran. Jehovah had directed him to go east. Jonah headed west, and as far west as he could go. He went down to the coast, to a port city named Joppa, where he found a ship headed to Tarshish. Some scholars say that Tarshish was in Spain. If so, Jonah was heading some 2,200 miles away from Nineveh. Such a voyage to the far end of the Great Sea might have taken as long as a year. Jonah was that determined to get away from the assignment Jehovah had given him.
Jonah 1:3 reads, "And Jonah proceeded to get up and run away to Tarshish from before Jehovah. And he finally came down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid its fare and went down into it, in order to go with them to Tarshish from before Jehovah."
Does this mean that we can dismiss Jonah as a coward? We should not be too quick to judge him. As we shall see, he was capable of remarkable personal courage. Like all of us, though, Jonah was an imperfect human, struggling with a great many faults. Who of us has never grappled with fear? Paragraph 9 question: how might we occasionally feel about an assignment from Jehovah, and what truth do we need to remember at such times? It may occasionally seem that God asks us to do what strikes us as difficult, even impossible. We may even find it daunting to preach the good news of God's kingdom, as Christians are required to do. It is all too easy for us to forget the profound truth that Jesus uttered. All things are possible with God. Mark 10:27. If at times we lose sight of that truth, perhaps we can understand Jonah's difficulty. What, though, were the consequences of Jonah's flight? Jehovah disciplines his wayward prophet. Paragraphs 10 and 11 question A. What may Jonah have hoped as the cargo ship left port? Question B. What danger came upon the ship and the crew? We can just imagine Jonah getting himself situated on that vessel, likely a Phoenician cargo ship. He watched as the captain and his crew bustled about to get their craft under way and out of port. As the shoreline slowly receded and disappeared, Jonah may have hoped he was escaping the danger he so dreaded. But suddenly, the weather changed. Strong winds churned up the sea into a nightmarish rage with waves that might dwarf even modern-day vessels. How long did it take for that wooden craft to seem terribly small and frail, lost in a watery wilderness of towering waves and plunging canyons? Did Jonah know at that point what he later wrote, that Jehovah himself hurled forth a great wind at the sea? It is hard to say. He saw, though, that the mariners began crying out to their various gods, and he knew that no help would come from that direction. His account says, as for the ship, it was about to be wrecked. Jonah 1:4. And how could Jonah pray to the God he was running from? Paragraph 12, question A. Why should we not be too quick to judge Jonah for sleeping as the storm raged? Question B. How did Jehovah reveal the cause of the trouble? Feeling powerless to help, Jonah went below the deck of the ship and found a place to lie down. There he went fast asleep. The footnote reads, the Septuagint stresses the depth of Jonah's slumber by adding that he snored. However, lest we judge Jonah's sleep as a sign of indifference on his part, we might recall that sometimes an urge to sleep overcomes those who are very low in spirits. During Jesus' agonizing hours in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John were slumbering from grief. Luke 22:45. End of footnote. The captain found Jonah, woke him up, and urged him to pray to his God, as everyone else was doing. Convinced that there was something supernatural about this storm, the seamen cast lots to see which of the people on board might be the cause of their trouble. No doubt Jonah's heart sank as the lots eliminated one man after another. Soon the truth was plain. Jehovah was directing the storm, as well as the lots, toward one man, Jonah.
Jonah 1, 5-7 reads, "And the mariners began to fear and to call for aid, each one to his god. And they kept hurling out the articles that were in the ship to the sea, in order to lighten it of them. But Jonah himself had gone down to the innermost parts of the decked vessel, and he proceeded to lie down and go fast asleep. At length the ship captain came near to him and said to him, 'What is the matter with you, sleeper? Get up, call out to your God. Perhaps the true God will show himself caring about us, and we shall not perish.' And they began to say to one another, 'Come, and let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account we have this calamity.' And they kept casting lots, and finally the lot fell upon Jonah."
Paragraph 13, Question A. What did Jonah confess to the sailors? Question B. What did Jonah urge the sailors to do and why? Jonah told the sailors everything. He was a servant of the Almighty God, Jehovah. This was the God he was running from and had offended, putting them all in this terrible danger. The men were aghast. Jonah could see the terror in their eyes. They asked him what they should do to him in order to save the ship and their lives. What did he say? Jonah may have shuddered to think of himself drowning in that cold, wild sea. But how could he send all these men to such a death when he knew he could save them? So he urged them, "Lift me up and hurl me into the sea, and the sea will become still for you, because I am aware that it is on my account that this great tempest is upon you." Jonah 1:12. Paragraphs 14 and 15, Question A. How can we imitate Jonah's faith at its best? Question B. How did the sailors respond to Jonah's request? Hardly the words of a coward, are they? It must have warmed Jehovah's heart to see Jonah's brave, self-sacrificing spirit in that dire moment. Here we see Jonah's faith at its best. We can imitate it today by putting the welfare of others ahead of our own. When we see someone in need, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, do we give of ourselves in order to help out? How we please Jehovah when we do so! Perhaps the sailors were moved too, for at first they refused to comply. Instead, they did everything they could to work their way through the storm, but to no avail. The tempest only grew worse. Finally, they saw that they had no choice. Calling out to Jonah's God Jehovah to show them mercy, they lifted the man up and hurled him over the side into the sea. Jonah finds mercy and deliverance. Paragraphs 16 and 17 describe what happened to Jonah when he was thrown from the ship. Jonah plummeted into the raging waves. Perhaps he struggled, floundering a bit, and saw amid a chaos of foam and spray that the ship was swiftly moving away. But the mighty breakers crashed over him and forced him under. He sank down and down, sensing that all hope was gone. Jonah later described how he felt at this time. Fleeting images crossed his mind. He thought with sadness that he would never again see the beautiful temple of Jehovah in Jerusalem. He had the sensation of descending to the very depths of the sea, near the roots of the mountains, where seaweed entangled him. This, it seemed, was to be his pit, his grave.
Jonah 2, 2-6 reads, "Out of my distress I called out to Jehovah, and he proceeded to answer me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried for help. You heard my voice. When you threw me to the depths, into the heart of the open sea, then a very river encircled me. All your breakers and your waves, over me they passed on. And as for me, I said, I have been driven away from in front of your eyes. How shall I gaze again upon your holy temple? Waters encircled me, clear to the soul. The watery deep itself kept enclosing me. Weeds were wound around my head. To the bottoms of the mountains I went down. As for the earth, its bars were upon me for time indefinite. But out of the pit you proceeded to bring up my life, O Jehovah my God.
Paragraphs 18 and 19 question, what happened to Jonah in the depths of the sea? What kind of creature was involved? And who was behind these events? But wait, there was something moving nearby. An immense, dark shape, a living thing. Looming close, it darted at him. A great maw opened over him, engulfed him, swallowed him down. This must be the end. Yet Jonah sensed something astounding. He was still alive. He was neither crushed, nor digested, nor even suffocated. No, the breath of life was still in him, though he was in what should rightly be his grave. Slowly, Jonah became filled with awe. Without a doubt, it was his God, Jehovah, who had appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah 1:17. The footnote reads, when translated into Greek, the Hebrew word for fish was rendered sea monster or huge fish. Although there is no way to determine exactly what kind of sea creature was involved, it has been observed that there are sharks in the Mediterranean large enough to swallow a man whole. There are far larger sharks elsewhere. The whale shark can reach up to 45 feet in length, possibly even more. End of footnote. Paragraph 20 question, what can we learn about Jonah from the prayer he uttered inside the great fish? Minutes passed, stretching into hours. There, in the deepest darkness he had ever known, Jonah composed his thoughts and prayed to Jehovah God. His prayer, recorded fully in the 2nd chapter of Jonah, is revealing. It shows that Jonah had extensive knowledge of the Scriptures, for it often refers to the Psalms. It also shows a heartwarming quality, gratitude. Jonah concluded, as for me, with the voice of thanksgiving I will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to Jehovah. Jonah 2:9. Paragraph 21 question, what did Jonah learn about salvation, and what valuable lesson may we remember? There, in the unlikeliest of places, the inward parts of the fish, Jonah learned that salvation is something that Jehovah can bring to anyone, anywhere, anytime. Jonah 1:17. Even there, Jehovah found and saved his troubled servant. Only Jehovah could keep a man alive and well for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish. It is good for us to remember today that Jehovah is the God in whose hand your breath is. Daniel 5:23. We owe our every breath, our very existence to him. Are we grateful? Do we not then owe Jehovah our obedience? Paragraphs 22 and 23, question A. How was Jonah's gratitude soon put to the test? Question B. What can we learn from Jonah when it comes to the mistakes we make? What about Jonah? Did he learn to show his gratitude to Jehovah through obedience? He did. After 3 days and 3 nights, the fish brought Jonah right to the shore and vomited out Jonah onto the dry land. Jonah 2:10. Imagine, after all that, Jonah did not even have to swim ashore. Of course, he did have to find his way from that beach wherever it was. Before long, though, his spirit of gratitude was put to the test. Jonah 3:1 and 2 says, Then the word of Jehovah occurred to Jonah the 2nd time, saying, Get up, go to Nineveh the great city, and proclaim to her the proclamation that I am speaking to you. What would Jonah do? Jonah did not hesitate. We read, At that, Jonah got up and went to Nineveh in accord with the word of Jehovah. Jonah 3:3. Yes, he obeyed. Clearly, he had learned from his mistakes. In this too, we need to imitate Jonah's faith. We all sin. We all make mistakes. But do we give up, or do we learn from our mistakes and turn to a course of obedient service to God? Paragraphs 24 and 25, question A. Jonah eventually received what reward in his own lifetime? Question B. What rewards await Jonah in the future? Did Jehovah reward Jonah for his obedience? Indeed, he did. For one thing, it seems that Jonah eventually learned that those sailors had survived. The storm abated immediately after Jonah's self-sacrificing act, and those mariners began to fear Jehovah greatly and made a sacrifice to him instead of to their false gods. Jonah 1:15 and 16. An even greater reward came much later. Jesus used Jonah's time in the huge fish as a prophetic picture of his own time in the grave, or Sheol.
Matthew 12:38-40 reads, Then, as an answer to him, some of the scribes and Pharisees said, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. In reply, he said to them, A wicked and adulterous generation keeps on seeking for a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights.
How thrilled Jonah will be to learn of that blessing when he is resurrected to life on the earth. Jehovah wants to bless you too. Like Jonah, will you learn from your mistakes and display an obedient, selfless spirit? Questions to think about. Can you sympathize with Jonah's fear of an assignment from Jehovah? How did Jehovah show patience and mercy as he taught Jonah about obedience? How did Jonah show that he had learned from his mistakes? In what ways would you like to imitate the faith of Jonah? Chapter 14. He learned a lesson in mercy. Paragraph 1 question. What kind of journey lay ahead of Jonah, and how did he feel about his destination? Jonah would have plenty of time to think. Before him lay a journey of more than 500 miles, an overland trek that would take him about a month, perhaps even longer. To begin, he had to choose between the shorter routes and the safer ones, and then steadily make his way through valleys and over mountain passes beyond counting. He likely had to skirt the vast Syrian desert, ford such rivers as the mighty Euphrates, and seek shelter among foreigners in the towns and villages of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Assyria. As the days passed, he thought about the destination that he so dreaded, the city that drew closer with each step he took, Nineveh. Paragraph 2 question. How had Jonah learned that he could not run away from his assignment? One thing Jonah knew for certain. He could not turn around and run away from this assignment. He had tried that before. As we saw in the preceding chapter, Jehovah patiently taught Jonah by means of a windstorm at sea and a miraculous rescue involving a huge fish. 3 days later, Jonah was vomited out alive onto a beach, an odd and more compliant man. Paragraph 3 question. What quality had Jehovah shown toward Jonah? Yet what question arises? When Jehovah ordered Jonah to Nineveh the second time, the prophet obediently headed east on this long journey.
Jonah 3:1-3 reads, Then the word of Jehovah occurred to Jonah the second time, saying, Get up, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to her the proclamation that I am speaking to you. At that, Jonah got up and went to Nineveh in accord with the word of Jehovah. Now Nineveh herself proved to be a city great to God, with a walking distance of 3 days.
However, had he allowed Jehovah's discipline to work a thorough change in him? For instance, Jehovah had shown him mercy, saving him from drowning, holding back punishment for his rebellion, and giving him a second chance to carry out this assignment. After all of this, had Jonah learned to show mercy to others? Learning to show mercy is often difficult for imperfect humans. Let us see what we can gather from Jonah's struggle. A message of judgment and a surprising response. Paragraphs 4 and 5 question: why did Jehovah refer to Nineveh as the great city, and what does that teach us about him? Jonah did not see Nineveh as Jehovah did. We read, "Now Nineveh herself proved to be a city great to God." Jonah 3:3. 3 times the record of Jonah quotes Jehovah as referring to Nineveh, the great city. Jonah 1:2, 3:2, and 4:11. Why was this city great or important to Jehovah? Nineveh was ancient, being among the first cities that Nimrod established after the flood. It was vast, a metropolitan region that evidently included several other cities, requiring a man 3 days to walk from one end to the other. Nineveh was impressive, with stately temples, mighty walls, and other edifices. But none of these factors made the city important to Jehovah God. What mattered to him were the people. Nineveh had a huge population for that time. Despite the people's badness, Jehovah cared about them. He values human life and the potential that each individual has for repenting and learning to do what is right. Paragraph 6, question A. Why might Jonah have found Nineveh intimidating? Question B. What do we learn about Jonah from the preaching work that he carried out? When Jonah finally entered Nineveh, its sizable population of more than 120,000 may have made the place only more intimidating. The footnote reads, "It has been estimated that Samaria, the capital of the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, may have had some 20,000 to 30,000 inhabitants in Jonah's day, less than a fourth of Nineveh's population. In its heyday, Nineveh may have been the largest city in the world." End of footnote. He walked for a day, penetrating ever deeper into that teeming metropolis, perhaps looking for a suitable central location to start spreading his message. How would he reach these people? Had he learned to speak the Assyrian tongue? Or did Jehovah grant him that ability through a miracle? We do not know. It may be that Jonah made his proclamation in his native Hebrew and used an interpreter to relate it to the Ninevites. At any rate, his message was simple and not likely to win him any favor. "Only 40 days more, and Nineveh will be overthrown." Jonah 3:4. He spoke out boldly and repeatedly. In doing so, he showed remarkable courage and faith, qualities that Christians today need more than ever. Paragraphs 7 and 8, question A. How did the people of Nineveh respond to Jonah's message? Question B. What did the king of Nineveh do in response to Jonah's proclamation? Jonah's message got the Ninevites' attention. No doubt he braced himself for a hostile and violent response. Instead, something remarkable happened. People listened. His words spread like wildfire. Before long, the whole city was talking about Jonah's prophecy of doom.
Jonah 3:5 reads, "And the men of Nineveh began to put faith in God, and they proceeded to proclaim a fast and to put on sackcloth, from the greatest one of them even to the least one of them."
Rich and poor, strong and weak, young and old, were all caught up in the same repentant spirit. They abstained from food. News of this popular movement soon reached the ears of the king. The king, too, responded to Jonah's proclamation. Struck with godly fear, he rose up from his throne, removed his luxurious robes of state, put on the same rough clothing that his people were wearing, and even sat down in the ashes. With his great ones, or nobles, he issued a decree that turned the fast from a spontaneous popular movement into an official action of state. He ordered that all wear sackcloth, even the domestic animals. The footnote reads, "This detail may seem odd, but it is not without precedent in ancient times." Greek historian Herodotus noted that the ancient Persians grieved over the death of a popular general by including their livestock in the customs of mourning. End of footnote. He humbly acknowledged that his people were guilty of badness and violence. Expressing hope that the true God would soften upon seeing their repentance, the king said, "God may turn back from his burning anger, so that we may not perish." Jonah 3, 6-9. Paragraph 9 question. Critics have expressed what doubt regarding the Ninevites, but how do we know that the critics are mistaken? Some critics express doubt that such a change of heart could have occurred so quickly among the Ninevites. However, Bible scholars have noted that a movement of that kind was not out of keeping with the superstitious and volatile nature of people of such cultures in ancient times. Further, we know that such critics are mistaken, for Jesus Christ himself later referred to the repentance of the Ninevites.
Matthew 12:41 reads, "Men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and will condemn it, because they repented at what Jonah preached. But look, something more than Jonah is here."
Jesus knew what he was talking about, for he had been alive in heaven to witness those events as they unfolded. The truth is, we should never assume that it is impossible for people to repent, no matter how vicious they may seem to us. Only Jehovah can read what lies within the human heart. A contrast between divine mercy and human rigidity. Paragraphs 10 and 11, question A. How did Jehovah respond to the repentance of the Ninevites? Question B. Why can we be sure that Jehovah's judgment was not in error? How did Jehovah react to the Ninevites' repentance? Jonah later wrote, "The true God got to see their works, that they had turned back from their bad way, and so the true God felt regret over the calamity that he had spoken of causing to them, and he did not cause it." Jonah 3:10. Does this mean that Jehovah decided that his own judgment about Nineveh had been in error? No. The Bible explains that Jehovah's justice is perfect.
Deuteronomy 32:4 reads, "The rock, perfect is his activity, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness, with whom there is no injustice. Righteous and upright is he."
Jehovah's righteous anger against Nineveh simply abated. He observed the change in those people and saw that the punishment he had intended to bring on them would no longer be fitting. This was an occasion to show divine mercy. Paragraphs 12 and 13, question A. How does Jehovah show that he is reasonable, adaptable, and merciful? Question B. Why was Jonah's prophecy not a false one? Jehovah is nothing like the rigid, cold, even harsh God so often portrayed by religious leaders. On the contrary, he is reasonable, adaptable, and merciful. When he determines to bring punishment on the wicked, he first uses his representatives on earth to issue warnings, for he is eager to see the wicked do what the Ninevites did, repent and change their ways. Jehovah told his prophet Jeremiah, at any moment that I may speak against a nation and against a kingdom, to uproot it, and to pull it down, and to destroy it, and that nation actually turns back from its badness against which I spoke, I will also feel regret over the calamity that I had thought to execute upon it. Jeremiah 18:7-8. Was Jonah's prophecy a false one? No, it fulfilled its purpose as a warning. That warning was based on the Ninevites' bad ways, which subsequently changed. Should the Ninevites resume their wicked ways, God would bring the same judgment against them. That is exactly what happened later on. Paragraph 14 question: how did Jonah react to Jehovah's mercy on Nineveh? How did Jonah react when destruction did not come at the time he expected it to? We read, "To Jonah, though, it was highly displeasing, and he got to be hot with anger." Jonah 4:1. Jonah even uttered a prayer that sounds like a rebuke of the Almighty. Jonah suggested that he should have stayed home on his own ground. He claimed that he knew all along that Jehovah would not bring calamity on Nineveh, even using that as an excuse for his running away to Tarshish in the first place. Then he asked to die, saying that death would be better than life.
Jonah 4:2-3 reads, "Hence he prayed to Jehovah and said, Ah, now, O Jehovah, was not this an affair of mine, while I happened to be on my own ground? That is why I went ahead and ran away to Tarshish, for I knew that you were a God gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and feeling regret over the calamity. And now, O Jehovah, take away, please, my soul from me, for my dying is better than my being alive."
Paragraph 15, question A. What may have led Jonah into a downward spiral? Question B. How did Jehovah deal with his distressed prophet? What was troubling Jonah? We cannot know all that went through his mind, but we do know that Jonah had proclaimed doom to Nineveh before all those people. They had believed him, and now no doom was coming. Did he fear being ridiculed or being labeled a false prophet? Whatever the case, he did not rejoice over the people's repentance or over Jehovah's mercy. Instead, it seems he was on a downward spiral into a mire of bitterness, self-pity, and wounded pride. Evidently, though, Jonah's merciful God still saw good in this distressed prophet. Instead of punishing Jonah for his disrespect, Jehovah simply asked him one gentle, probing question: Have you rightly become hot with anger? Jonah 4:4. Did Jonah even answer? The Bible record is silent. Paragraph 16 question: In what ways might some find themselves disagreeing with God, and what lesson can we learn from Jonah's example? It is easy to judge Jonah for his conduct, but we do well to remember that it is not unusual for imperfect humans to disagree with God. Some may believe that Jehovah should have prevented a tragedy, or that he should have executed swift judgment against the wicked, or even that he should have brought an end to this whole world system of things before now. Jonah's example serves to remind us that when we disagree with Jehovah God, it is always our own point of view that needs an adjustment, never his. How Jehovah taught Jonah a lesson. Paragraphs 17 and 18, question A. What did Jonah do after leaving Nineveh? Question B. How did Jehovah's miracles involving a bottle gourd plant affect Jonah? The despondent prophet left Nineveh and headed not home, but eastward, where some mountains overlooked the region. He built a little shelter and settled in to wait and to watch Nineveh. Perhaps he still clung to the hope of witnessing her destruction. How would Jehovah teach this hard-headed man to be merciful? Overnight, Jehovah caused a bottle gourd plant to sprout up. Jonah woke to see this luxuriant growth, with its broad leaves providing far more shade than his flimsy shelter ever could. His spirits lifted. Jonah began to rejoice greatly over the plant, perhaps viewing its miraculous appearance as a sign of God's blessing and approval. However, Jehovah wanted to do more for Jonah than simply deliver him from the heat and from his own petulant anger. He wanted to reach Jonah's heart. So God performed additional miracles. He sent a worm to attack and kill the plant. Then he sent a parching east wind until Jonah began swooning away because of the heat. Jonah 4:6-8. The man's spirits plummeted, and again he asked God that he might die. Paragraphs 19 and 20 question, how did Jehovah reason with Jonah about the bottle gourd plant? Once more, Jehovah asked Jonah if he was rightly angry, this time over the death of the bottle gourd plant. Instead of repenting, Jonah justified himself, saying, I have rightly become hot with anger, to the point of death. Jonah 4:9. The stage was now set for Jehovah to drive the lesson home. God reasoned with Jonah, saying that the prophet was feeling sorry over the death of a mere plant that had sprung up overnight, one that Jonah neither planted nor caused to grow. Then God concluded, For my part, ought I not to feel sorry for Nineveh, the great city, in which there exist more than 120,000 men who do not at all know the difference between their right hand and their left, besides many domestic animals? Jonah 4:10 and 11. The footnote reads, God's saying that those people did not know right from left suggested their childlike ignorance of divine standards. End of footnote. Paragraph 21, question A. What object lesson did Jehovah teach Jonah? Question B. How may the account about Jonah help us to take an honest look at ourselves? Do you see the depth of Jehovah's object lesson? Jonah had never done a thing to take care of that plant. Jehovah, on the other hand, was the source of life for those Ninevites and had sustained them as he does all creatures on earth. How could Jonah place more value on a single plant than he did on the lives of 120,000 humans, in addition to all their livestock? Was it not because Jonah had allowed his thinking to become selfish? After all, he felt sorry for the plant only because it had benefited him personally. Did not his anger over Nineveh spring from motives that were likewise selfish? A prideful desire to save face, to be proved right? Jonah's story may help us to take an honest look at ourselves. Who of us is immune to such selfish tendencies? How grateful we should be that Jehovah patiently teaches us to be more selfless, more compassionate, more merciful, as He is. Paragraph 22, question A. How was Jonah evidently affected by Jehovah's wise instruction about mercy? Question B. What lesson do we all need to learn? The question is, did Jonah take the lesson to heart? The book bearing his name ends with Jehovah's question hanging there, in effect still echoing. Some critics might complain that Jonah never answers. In truth, though, his answer is there. It is the book itself. You see, evidence indicates that Jonah wrote the book bearing his name. Just imagine that prophet, once again safe in his homeland, writing this account. We can almost picture an older, wiser, humbler man, ruefully shaking his head as he describes his own mistakes, his rebellion, and his stubborn refusal to show mercy. Clearly, Jonah did learn a vital lesson from Jehovah's wise instruction. He learned to be merciful. Will we?
Matthew 5:7 reads, Happy are the merciful, since they will be shown mercy.
Questions to think about. How did Jonah show faith and courage as he preached in Nineveh? What can we learn from the Ninevites' repentance? What can we learn from Jonah's attitude toward the repentance of the Ninevites? In what ways would you like to imitate the faith of Jonah when you receive corrective counsel? Chapter 15. She stood up for God's people. Paragraphs 1 to 3, question A. Why might Esther have felt intimidated by the prospect of approaching her husband? Question B. We will discuss what questions regarding Esther. Esther tried to calm her heart as she approached the courtyard in the palace at Shushan. It was not easy. Everything about the castle was designed to inspire awe. Its multicolored relief sculptures of winged bulls, archers, and lions of glazed brickwork, its fluted stone columns and imposing statues, even its position atop huge platforms near the snow-capped Zagros Mountains and overlooking the pure waters of the river Coaspis. All of it was intended to remind each visitor of the immense power of the man whom Esther was going to see, the one who called himself the Great King. He was also her husband. Husband! How different Ahasuerus was from the kind of husband any faithful Jewish girl might have expected. The footnote reads, Ahasuerus is widely thought to have been Xerxes I, who ruled the Persian Empire early in the 5th century BCE. End of footnote. He did not look to such examples as Abraham, a man who humbly accepted God's direction to listen to Sarah his wife. The king knew little or nothing of Esther's God Jehovah or of his law. Ahasuerus knew Persian law, though, including a law forbidding the very thing that Esther was about to do. What was that? Well, the law said that anyone who appeared before the Persian monarch without first being summoned by the king was liable to death. Esther had not been summoned, but she was going to the king anyway. As she drew near to the inner courtyard where she would be visible from the king's throne, she may have felt that she was walking to her death.
Esther 4:11 reads, All the king's servants and the people of the king's jurisdictional districts are aware that, as regards any man or woman that comes into the king at the inner courtyard who is not called, his one law is to have him put to death. Only in case the king holds out to him the golden scepter, he will also certainly stay alive. As for me, I have not been called to come into the king now for 30 days. Esther 5:1 reads, And it came about on the 3rd day that Esther went dressing up royally, after which she took her stand in the inner courtyard of the king's house, opposite the king's house, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal house opposite the entrance of the house.
Why did she take such a risk? And what can we learn from the faith of this remarkable woman? First, let us see how Esther got into the unusual position of being a queen in Persia. Esther's background. Paragraph 4 question. What was Esther's background? And how did she come to live with her cousin Mordecai? Esther was an orphan. We know very little of the parents who named her Hadassah, a Hebrew word for myrtle, a lovely white-blossomed shrub. When Esther's parents died, one of her relatives, a kindly man named Mordecai, took pity on the child. He was her cousin, but Mordecai was much older. He brought Esther into his home and treated her as his own daughter. Paragraphs 5 and 6, question A. How did Mordecai raise Esther? Question B. What kind of life did Esther and Mordecai lead in Shushan? Mordecai and Esther lived as Jewish exiles in that Persian capital, where they probably had to deal with a measure of disdain because of their religion and the law they tried to follow. But Esther surely drew closer to her cousin as he taught her about Jehovah the merciful God who had rescued his people from trouble many times in the past, and would do so again. Clearly, a loving and loyal bond grew between Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai evidently worked as some kind of official at the castle at Shushan, regularly sitting within its gate along with other servants of the king. How the young Esther passed her time as she grew up, we can only guess, although it seems safe to say that she took good care of her older cousin and his home, which was likely situated in the humbler quarters across the river from the royal castle. Perhaps she enjoyed going to the market in Shushan, where goldsmiths, silversmiths, and other merchants displayed their wares. Esther could not have imagined that such luxuries would later become commonplace to her. She had no idea of the future in store for her. Beautiful in appearance. Paragraph 7 question: why was Vashti deposed as queen, and what was the result? One day, Shushan was buzzing with gossip about turmoil in the household of the king. At a grand feast, where Ahasuerus was entertaining his noblemen with sumptuous food and wine, the king decided to summon his beautiful queen Vashti, who was feasting separately with the women. But Vashti refused to come. Humiliated and enraged, the king asked his advisers how Vashti should be punished. The result? She was deposed as queen. The king's servants began searching throughout the land for beautiful young virgins. From among them the king would select a new queen. Paragraph 8, question A. Why might Mordecai have felt some concern about Esther as she grew up? Question B. How do you think we might apply the Bible's balanced view of physical beauty? We may imagine Mordecai gazing fondly at Esther from time to time and noting with a mixture of pride and concern that his little cousin was grown up and had turned out to be a remarkable beauty. The young woman was pretty in form and beautiful in appearance, we read. Esther 2:7. The Bible presents a balanced view of physical beauty. It is delightful, but it needs to be coupled with wisdom and humility. Otherwise, it may breed vanity, pride, and other ugly traits of the heart.
Proverbs 11:22 reads, "As a gold nose ring in the snout of a pig, so is a woman that is pretty, but that is turning away from sensibleness."
Have you ever seen that to be true? In Esther's case, what would beauty turn out to be? An asset or a liability? Time would tell. Paragraph 9, question A. What happened when the king's servants noticed Esther, and why must her parting from Mordecai have been difficult? Question B. Why did Mordecai allow Esther to marry a pagan unbeliever? The king's servants noticed Esther. They gathered her up in their search, taking her away from Mordecai and off to the grand palace across the river. It must have been a difficult parting, for the two were like father and daughter. Mordecai would not have wanted his adopted daughter to marry any unbeliever, even a king, but events were out of his control. How eagerly Esther must have listened to Mordecai's words of advice before she was taken away. As she was led to Shushan the castle, her mind was filled with questions. What kind of life lay ahead of her? She won favor in the eyes of everyone seeing her. Paragraphs 10 and 11, question A. How might Esther's new environment easily have affected her? Question B. How did Mordecai show his concern for Esther's welfare? Esther found herself ushered into a world that was entirely new and strange to her. She was among many young women who had been gathered from far and wide in the Persian Empire. Esther 2:8 and 12. Their customs, languages, and attitudes must have varied greatly. Placed under the charge of an official named Hegai, the young women were to undergo an extensive beauty treatment, a year-long program that included massages with fragrant oils. Such an environment and lifestyle might easily have bred an obsession with personal appearance among those young women, along with vanity and competitiveness. How was Esther affected? No one on earth could have been more concerned about Esther than Mordecai was. We read that day by day he made his way as near as he could to the house of the women and endeavored to learn of Esther's welfare. As bits of information trickled out to him, perhaps through cooperative servants in the household, he must have beamed with fatherly pride. Why? Paragraphs 12 and 13, question A. What impression did Esther make on those around her? Question B. Why would Mordecai have been pleased to learn that Esther had not revealed her Jewish heritage? Esther so impressed Hegai that he treated her with great loving kindness, giving her 7 servant girls and the best place in the house of the women. The account even says, all the while Esther was continually gaining favor in the eyes of everyone seeing her. Esther 2, 9 and 15. Would beauty alone have impressed everyone so profoundly? No, there was much more to Esther than that. For instance, we read, Esther had not told about her people or about her relatives, for Mordecai himself had laid the command upon her that she should not tell. Esther 2:10. Mordecai had instructed the girl to be discreet about her Jewish heritage. He no doubt saw that among Persian royalty there was much prejudice against his people. What a pleasure it was for him to learn that now, even though Esther was out of his sight, she still showed the same wise and obedient spirit. Paragraph 14, question. How can young people today imitate Esther's example? Young people today can likewise bring joy to the hearts of parents and guardians. When out of their parents' sight, even if surrounded by people who are shallow, immoral, or vicious, they can resist bad influences and stick to the standards that they know are right. When they do so, like Esther, they make the heart of their heavenly Father rejoice.
Proverbs 27:11 reads, Be wise, my son, and make my heart rejoice, that I may make a reply to him that is taunting me.
Paragraphs 15 and 16, question A. How did Esther win the king's love? Question B. Why might the changes in Esther's life have been challenging? When the time came for Esther to be presented to the king, she was given the liberty to select any items that she thought she might need, perhaps to beautify herself further. Modestly, though, she asked for nothing beyond what Hegai mentioned to her. She probably realized that beauty alone would not win the king's heart. A modest and humble spirit would prove a far rarer commodity in that court. Was she right? The account answers, The king came to love Esther more than all the other women, so that she gained more favor and loving kindness before him than all the other virgins. And he proceeded to put the royal headdress upon her head and make her queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2:17. It must have been hard for this humble Jewish girl to adjust to the change in her life. She was the new queen, wife to the most powerful monarch on earth at that time. Did her new position go to her head, filling her with pride? Far from it. Paragraph 17, question A. In what ways did Esther remain obedient to her adoptive father? Question B. Why is Esther's example an important one for us today? Esther remained obedient to her adoptive father Mordecai. She kept her connection to the Jewish people a secret. Further, when Mordecai uncovered a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus, Esther obediently passed his warning along to the king, and the plotters were foiled. She still expressed faith in her God by showing a humble, obedient spirit. How we need Esther's example today, when obedience is rarely valued as a virtue, and when disobedience and rebellion are the norm. But people of genuine faith treasure obedience, as Esther did. Esther's faith under test. Paragraph 18, question A. Why might Mordecai have refused to bow down to Haman? Question B. How do men and women of faith today imitate the example of Mordecai? A man named Haman rose to prominence in the court of Ahasuerus. The king appointed him prime minister, making Haman his principal advisor and the second in command in the empire. The king even decreed that all who saw this official must bow down to him. For Mordecai, that law posed a problem. He believed in obeying the king, but not at the cost of disrespecting God. You see, Haman was an Agagite. That evidently means that he was a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king who was executed by God's prophet Samuel. So wicked were the Amalekites that they had made themselves enemies of Jehovah and Israel. As a people, the Amalekites stood condemned by God. The footnote reads, Haman may have been among the very last of the Amalekites, since the remnant of them had been destroyed back in the days of King Hezekiah. End of footnote. How could a faithful Jew bow down to an Amalekite? Mordecai could not. He stood his ground. To this day, men and women of faith have risked their lives to adhere to this principle. We must obey God as ruler rather than men. Acts 5:29. Paragraph 19, question. What did Haman want to do, and how did he go about persuading the king? Haman was enraged, but it was not enough for him to find a way to kill off Mordecai. He wanted to exterminate all of Mordecai's people. Haman persuaded the king by painting a dark portrait of the Jews. Without naming them, he implied that they were inconsequential, a people scattered and separated among the peoples. Esther 3:5-10. Even worse, he said that they did not obey the king's laws, hence they were dangerous rebels. He proposed to donate to the king's treasury an immense sum of money to cover the expense of slaughtering all the Jews in the empire. The footnote reads, Haman offered 10,000 silver talents, worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. If Ahasuerus was Xerxes I, the money might have made Haman's offer more appealing. Xerxes needed a vast store of funds to carry out his long-proposed but ultimately disastrous war against Greece. End of footnote. Ahasuerus gave Haman the king's own signet ring to seal any order that he had in mind. Paragraphs 20 and 21, question A. How did Haman's proclamation affect the Jews throughout the Persian Empire, including Mordecai? Question B. What did Mordecai implore Esther to do? Soon messengers were speeding on horseback to every corner of the vast empire, delivering what amounted to a death sentence on the Jewish people. Imagine the impact of such a proclamation when it reached far-off Jerusalem, where a remnant of Jews who had returned from exile in Babylon were struggling to rebuild a city that still had no wall to defend it. Perhaps Mordecai thought of them as well as of his own friends and relatives in Shushan when he heard the terrible news. Distraught, he ripped his clothes, wore sackcloth, and placed ashes on his head, and cried aloud in the middle of the city. Haman, however, sat drinking with the king, unmoved by the grief he had stirred up among the many Jews and their friends in Shushan.
Esther 3:12-4:1 reads, The king's secretaries were then called, in the first month on the 13th day of it, and writing went on according to all that Haman commanded the king's satraps and the governors who were over the different jurisdictional districts, and the princes of the different peoples, of each jurisdictional district, in its own style of writing, and each people in its own tongue. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and it was sealed with the king's signet ring. And there was a sending of the letters by means of couriers to all the king's jurisdictional districts, to annihilate, to kill, and to destroy all the Jews. young man as well as old man, little ones and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month Adar, and to plunder the spoil of them. A copy of the writing to be given as law in all the different jurisdictional districts was being published to all the peoples, for them to become ready for this day. The couriers themselves went out, being moved to speed because of the king's word, and the law itself was given in Shushan the castle. As for the king and Haman, they sat down to drink, but as for the city of Shushan, it was in confusion. And Mordecai himself got knowledge of everything that had been done. And Mordecai proceeded to rip his garments apart, and put on sackcloth and ashes, and go out into the middle of the city and cry out with a loud and bitter outcry.
Mordecai knew that he had to act. But what could he do? Esther heard of his distress and sent clothes to him, but Mordecai refused to take comfort. Maybe he had long wondered why his God Jehovah had allowed dear Esther to be taken from him and made the queen of a pagan ruler. Now the reason seemed to be emerging. Mordecai sent a message to the queen, imploring Esther to intercede with the king to stand up for her own people. Esther 4:4-8. Paragraph 22 question. Why was Esther afraid to appear before her husband, the king? Esther's heart must have sunk when she heard that message. Here was her greatest test of faith. She was afraid, as she freely revealed in her reply to Mordecai. She reminded him of the king's law. To appear before the king unsummoned meant a death sentence. Only if the king held out his golden scepter was the offender spared. And did Esther have any reason to expect such clemency, especially in view of Vashti's fate when she had refused the king's command to appear? Esther told Mordecai that the king had not invited her to see him in 30 days. Such neglect left her plenty of reason to wonder if she had fallen out of favor with this capricious monarch. The footnote reads, Xerxes I was known for his mercurial, violent temper. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded some examples from Xerxes' war against Greece. The king ordered that a pontoon bridge of ships be built across the Strait of Hellespont. When a storm ruined the bridge, Xerxes ordered the engineers beheaded, and even had his men punish the Hellespont by whipping the water while an insulting proclamation was read aloud. In the same campaign, when a wealthy man begged that his son be excused from joining the army, Xerxes had the son cut in half, his body displayed as a warning. End of footnote. Paragraph 23, question A. What did Mordecai say to bolster Esther's faith? Question B. Why is Mordecai worthy of imitation? Mordecai replied firmly to bolster Esther's faith. He assured her that if she failed to act, salvation for the Jews would arise from some other source. But how could she expect to be spared once the persecution gathered force? Here Mordecai showed his profound faith in Jehovah, who would never let his people be exterminated and his promises go unfulfilled. Then Mordecai asked Esther, Who is there knowing whether it is for a time like this that you have attained to royal dignity? Esther 4:12-14. Is not Mordecai worthy of imitation? He trusted completely in his God Jehovah. Do we? A faith stronger than the fear of death. Paragraph 24 question. How did Esther show faith and courage? For Esther, the time of decision had arrived. She asked Mordecai to get her countrymen to join her in a 3-day fast, concluding her message with a statement that resonates down to this day in its simple faith and courage. In case I must perish, I must perish. Esther 4:15-17. She must have prayed more fervently in those 3 days than she ever had in her life. Finally, though, The moment came. She dressed in her very best royal finery, doing all she could to appeal to the king. Then she went. Paragraph 25. Describe how events unfolded as Esther appeared before her husband. As described at the outset of this chapter, Esther made her way to the king's court. We can only imagine the anxious thoughts and fervent prayers filling her mind and heart. She entered the courtyard where she could see Ahasuerus on his throne. Perhaps she tried to read the expression on his face, the face that was framed by the carefully tended symmetrical curls of his hair and of his squared beard. If she had to wait, it must have felt like an eternity. But the moment passed. Her husband saw her. He was surely surprised, but his expression softened. He held out his golden scepter. Paragraph 26 question. Why do true Christians need courage like Esther's? And why was her work only beginning? Esther had gained an audience, a hearing ear. She had taken a stand for her God and for her people, setting a beautiful example of faith for all servants of God down through time. True Christians today cherish such examples. Jesus said that his genuine followers would be marked by self-sacrificing love.
John 13:34 and 35 reads, I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves.
Showing such love often requires courage like Esther's. But even after Esther stood up for God's people that day, her work was only beginning. How would she convince the king that his favorite advisor, Haman, was a wicked schemer? How could she help to save her people? We will consider these questions in the following chapter. Questions to think about. How did Esther show that she was humble and obedient? How did Mordecai help Esther to act faithfully? What actions reveal Esther's courage? In what ways would you like to imitate the faith of Esther?